"You have $3.14, the manager said loud enough for the whole room to hear. "This is a Michelin-starred restaurant, not a soup kitchen. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The old woman didn't argue. She just looked down at the coins in her trembling hand and nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've been turned away so many times that shame no longer surprises them. Then a voice cut across the room like a blade. "Touch her, and you'll regret it for the rest of your life." If you're watching this story, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The night Clara Whitman walked into Moretti's on West Erie Street, the temperature outside had dropped to 11 degrees, and the wind off Lake Michigan was the kind that didn't just bite. It reached inside a person and took something they couldn't name. She had been walking for 40 minutes in shoes that had no business being worn in weather like this. Thin canvas sneakers, with a split along the left sole that let the wet in with every step. Her coat was a tan wool thing from a decade ago, missing 2 buttons and cinched at the waist with a strip of fabric she'd torn from an old pillowcase because the belt had broken the previous winter and she'd never been able to replace it. She almost didn't go in. She stood outside the restaurant for a long moment, looking at the gold lettering on the glass, at the warm amber light spilling through the window, at the shapes of people inside, moving through what looked like another world. Entirely, a world of white tablecloths and candles, and the kind of slow, deliberate movement that belongs only to people who have never once worried about where their next meal was coming from. She counted the coins in her coat pocket for the 4th time that evening, her fingers moving over each one with the same careful attention a jeweler gives to stones. $3.14. That was what she had. Not $3.14 and a little more somewhere she'd forgotten about. Not $3.14 with a bill tucked inside her shoe for emergencies. $3.14 was the whole of it, every last piece, and she had been trying to make it stretch since yesterday morning, when she'd used her last $2 on a cup of coffee and a roll from a cart on Michigan Avenue, because her hands had been shaking so badly from the cold that she'd needed something warm just to keep moving. She pushed the door open. The heat hit her first, and for a moment it was so overwhelming after the cold outside that her eyes filled with water. She blinked it back, told herself it was just the change in temperature, and moved toward the front counter, where a man in a black jacket with slicked hair, and the practiced look of someone whose job it was to assess people and find them wanting, was already watching her approach. The restaurant was full. That was the first thing she noticed after the warmth. Every table occupied the low murmur of conversation filling the room like water fills a glass, slowly and completely. Men in suits. Women in jewelry that cost more than most people made in a year. Bottles of wine she couldn't have named from places she'd never been. The smell of food, real food, garlic and cream, and something rich and meaty hit her so hard that her stomach contracted and she had to press her hand flat against the counter to steady herself. "Can I help you?" the manager said. He didn't say it warmly. Clara opened her coat pocket and placed the coins on the marble counter. She arranged them carefully, the way she'd been doing things carefully her whole life, a habit so deep it had outlasted everything else. "I have $3.14, she said. "I was wondering if that might be enough for a bowl of soup." The manager looked at the coins. He looked at her. His expression didn't change exactly, but something shifted behind it, some decision being made that she could see forming even as he opened his mouth. "You have $3.14, he said, and he said it loud, loud enough that the nearest tables went quiet, loud enough that the sound carried toward the back of the room, loud enough that it was no longer a private conversation between a woman who needed something and the person who might provide it. He had made it a public event. He had made her an exhibit. "This is a Michelin-starred restaurant, not a soup kitchen. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Clara didn't flinch. She had been flinching her whole life, and somewhere in the past year she had simply run out of the energy required to do it. She looked down at the coins. She nodded slowly. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'm sorry to have bothered you." She began to gather the coins back. Touch her, and you'll regret it for the rest of your life." The voice came from the back of the room, and it had the quality of something that didn't need to be raised to be heard. It simply cut through every other sound in the space, the way a surgical instrument cuts precisely completely without waste. People at tables near the source of the voice went still first. Then it rippled outward table by table, until the entire restaurant had fallen into a silence so complete that Clara could hear the slight wheeze in her own breathing. She turned. The man walking toward her was not what she had been expecting, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark suit that fit him the way expensive things always seem to fit certain men, as though it had been constructed specifically around his particular way of holding himself. He was in his early 40s with dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that had been handsome once and was now something more than handsome, the years having turned it from a young man's face into something harder and more specific. He moved through the restaurant the way water moves through rock, not around things, but through them, and people shifted out of his path without appearing to make a decision to do so. She had not known who he was when she walked in. She knew who he was now. You didn't live in Chicago for 73 years without knowing the name Adrian Moretti. Even people who spent their lives carefully looking away from anything connected to the way this city actually operated, even people like Clara, who had spent her life doing exactly that, teaching elementary school for 31 years, raising 2 daughters on her own, after her husband died, going to church on Sundays, and keeping her head down and doing her best to move through the world without causing harm. Even those people knew that name. It lived in the city the way weather lived in it, as something you were aware of even when you weren't looking directly at it. The coldest man in Chicago was walking across his own restaurant to stand beside an old woman with coins on a marble counter. He stopped in front of her. He looked at the coins. He looked at her face. And then he looked at something else, something specific, something on her left wrist, and his expression changed in a way that was very slight and very complete, like watching a muscle relax after years of tension. "What's your name?" he asked, and his voice was entirely different now. Still low, still precise, but something else in it. Something she had not expected to find in that face, in that voice in this room. "Clara," she said. "Clara Whitman." He pulled out a chair at the nearest table. "Sit down, Mrs. Whitman," he said. "Tonight you won't pay for anything." The manager opened his mouth. Adrian turned and looked at him. The manager closed his mouth. Clara sat down. She told herself she wasn't going to cry. She had made that promise to herself a long time ago, the year everything fell apart, and she had kept it through worse than this. She kept it now. She sat in the chair with her back straight, the way her own mother had taught her, the way she had taught her daughters, and she put her hands flat on the white tablecloth and breathed. The waiter who appeared at her side was young, maybe 25, and he had the kind of face that belonged to someone's good nephew. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her as though she were simply a guest, as though her presence at this table on this evening was an unremarkable and entirely natural thing, and she was so grateful to him for that small mercy that she had to look down at her hands for a moment before she could speak. "Just soup," she told him. "Whatever you have. Anything warm." "Of course," he said, and walked away without elaborating, without commenting, without performing any of the small cruelties that could so easily have been layered into that exchange. Adrian sat down across from her. He had sent his companions, she had noticed without looking directly, that he'd been sitting with 4 or 5 men, the kind of men who were clearly not there to discuss municipal planning, back to their table with a gesture so subtle she almost missed it. A slight tilt of the chin. And they had gone without question, without comment, the way men go when they have spent their lives learning to read a single gesture from a particular person and respond to it without debate. Now it was just the 2 of them at a table in the center of this restaurant full of people who were doing their level best to appear as though they were not watching every second of this exchange. "How long have you been out in this weather?" Adrian asked. "A while," Clara said. She wasn't trying to be evasive. She genuinely was not certain of the exact number of hours. Time had a way of blurring at the edges when you were cold enough. Where did you come from tonight? She looked at him. There was a calculus happening inside her, the kind she had been performing all her life, without always knowing she was performing it. The assessment of another person's intentions, the weighing of what to say against what to hold back, the question of trust. She had always been good at this. 31 years of reading which child needed what. From her, which parent was actually asking what they seemed to be asking. Which administrator was honestly trying to help versus performing the appearance of trying to help you develop a skill for it, whether you meant to or not. She looked at Adrian Moretti and she ran her calculus, and she said Rosewood Haven. Something happened in his face. Not much. He was a man who had spent decades keeping his face still, that was obvious, but there was something, a flicker, a recognition not of surprise exactly, but of a particular kind of attention suddenly made more acute. The care facility, he said, not a question. Yes. On North Clark Street. Yes. Victor Halston's place. Clara picked up the spoon the waiter had just set down with a basket of bread, and she held it and she said, yes, Victor Halston's place. The soup arrived. It was minestrone, rich and deep red with tomato, thick with vegetables and small pasta, fragrant with basil, and something else. Rosemary, maybe? And the heat of the bowl against her hands was so immediate and so physical that for a moment she couldn't do anything but hold it and let that warmth work its way into her fingers, into her palms, into the joints that had been aching for months. She ate. Adrian watched her, not in the way people sometimes watch the hungry eat, which is with a complicated performance of looking away and looking back, a kind of guilty theater. He watched her the way you watch someone you are trying to understand, directly without apology, but also without the weight of judgment. She took small bites. She tasted each one. And then when she thought he wasn't looking quite as closely, she broke a piece of bread from the basket and wrapped it carefully in her napkin and placed it inside her coat pocket. He saw it. She knew he saw it. He didn't say a word. You didn't just walk out tonight, he said. You ran. I walked, she said. But yes, I left without telling anyone. How long were you there at Rosewood Haven? 8 months. She set down her spoon for a moment. I moved in after my daughter, my younger daughter Patricia. She was very worried about me. I had a fall in November, and she was all the way in Seattle, and she found Rosewood Haven in an online search, and it looked beautiful in the photographs. The rooms were bright. There was a garden. The staff smiled in every picture. She picked up her spoon again. Patricia paid the first 3 months herself. She was so relieved to have found somewhere she thought was safe. When did you realize it wasn't? Clara looked at the soup. She thought about how to say what she needed to say, which was not a matter of finding the words. She had the words. She had been assembling them for months, in the quiet of her room at night when she couldn't sleep, but of understanding whether this particular moment, this particular man was the place where those words would do any good. She reached into her coat pocket, not for the bread she had just put there, for something else, something she had been carrying for 4 months, something she had slept with inside her pillowcase because she didn't trust the drawers in her room, and she had learned the hard way early that her room was not always her room, in the way a room is supposed to belong to the person inside it. She set the notebook on the table. It was small, a pocket-sized composition book, the cardboard cover warped from being close to her body for so long, the pages soft with handling. The outside looked like nothing. It looked like the kind of thing you'd pass in a box at a garage sale and not pick up. Everything is in there, she said. Adrian didn't reach for it. He looked at it, and then he looked at her, and he said, "Tell me." So she told him. She started at the beginning the way a person who has been a teacher knows to start, because she understood that the only way someone truly understands a complicated thing is if they are walked through it in the right order. She started with the day she arrived at Rosewood Haven, because you needed to understand what it looked like at the beginning in order to understand what it became. When she arrived, it had been not beautiful. That was the wrong word. She was too honest to use a word that wasn't accurate, but it had been adequate. The staff had been attentive in those first weeks. Her room was clean. The food was edible. She had her own small bathroom, a window that looked out over a courtyard. a reading chair that she had arranged exactly right within the first 2 days, because after 73 years, she knew exactly how a reading chair needed to sit in relation to a window and a lamp. She had told Patricia it was fine. She had meant it. The first thing she noticed was the medication. Not her own medication specifically, though that became part of it later. What she noticed first was the change in her neighbor, a man named Harold Briggs, who had been an engineer for 40 years, and who in Clara's first 3 weeks at Rosewood Haven had been unfailingly sharp and dry and funny and present. Harold had opinions about everything. He had a particular view about the way the current generation of architecture students were being trained that he was delighted to share at length, and an equally particular view about the designated hitter rule in baseball, and a story about a bridge he'd helped design in 1987 that he told in a slightly different way each time, so that it never quite felt like a repeated story. Then one Thursday, Harold came to dinner, and he wasn't Harold anymore. He sat at the table, and he ate what was put in front of him, and he answered questions with single words, and his eyes, which had always been sharp and a little skeptical and entirely alive, were somewhere else. Not tired, not sad, somewhere else in a way that was not any natural state Clara had encountered in another person before. She asked one of the aides about it the next morning, casually, not wanting to create alarm. She asked if Harold was feeling all right. "Mr. Briggs is resting more comfortably now," the aide had told her. The doctor adjusted his medication. "It's much better for him." Clara had nodded and thanked her and gone back to her room and sat in her reading chair and looked out the window at the courtyard and thought about that phrase for a long time, resting more comfortably. She turned it over in her mind the way she used to turn difficult words over with her students, asking them to look at language from every angle until they understood what it was actually doing. Harold Briggs had not looked comfortable. He had looked gone. She started watching after that. She was systematic about it, a natural consequence of having organized 31 years of lesson plans and gradebooks and parent-teacher conferences. She began keeping notes in the pocket composition book she'd had in her bag since before she moved in, a habit from her teaching days that had simply never left her. Dates, names, what she observed, changes she noticed in residents before and after medication adjustments, staff who arrived and left suddenly, times when the building felt different at night, footsteps in the corridor at hours when there should have been no movement, voices behind closed doors that stopped abruptly when she passed. 3 weeks after she started keeping notes, a woman named Beverly Marsh, who had lived at Rosewood Haven for 2 years and who had a daughter in Evanston who visited every Sunday without fail, stopped having visitors. Clara asked Beverly about it. Beverly told her that her daughter had called to say she was too busy to visit for a while. Beverly said it with the particular flatness of someone who has absorbed something painful and is trying not to show how much it has cost her. The following Sunday, a woman showed up at the front desk asking to see Beverly Marsh. Clara was in the common room. She heard the whole exchange through the open doorway. "I'm sorry," the receptionist said. "Mrs. Marsh isn't available for visitors right now, per the family's request." The woman's voice went sharp and confused. "I am the family. I'm her daughter. What are you talking about?" A pause. "I'm afraid we have a note on file from the family requesting limited contact for Mrs. Marsh's well-being. If you'd like to speak with our director, get me your director right now." Clara did not hear what happened after that, because a staff member quietly closed the common room door. But Beverly's daughter's face, what she had glimpsed of it through the doorway in those few seconds, that face stayed with her. It was the face of someone who has walked into a room expecting to find something familiar and found instead a locked door where there had always been an open one. Beverly's daughter never did get in to see her mother that day, or the following Sunday, or the Sunday after that. She told Adrian all of this. She told him about the financial forms she had been asked to sign 3 months after her arrival, forms that she had read carefully because she always read everything carefully. Forms that transferred the management of her assets to Rosewood Haven's administrative trust for the purpose of, as the document phrased it, comprehensive care coordination. She had asked what that meant specifically. She had been told it was standard procedure. She had asked to speak with an attorney before signing. She had been told that was, of course, her right, though the administrator who said it had a particular way of saying it that made it feel like the statement was technically true and functionally a warning. She had not signed. 2 days later, her telephone privileges were restricted due to, she was told, a complaint about excessive noise during nighttime hours. She had not made any telephone calls during nighttime hours. She had not made any telephone calls at all for the previous 4 days because she had been nursing a head cold and had wanted to wait until she sounded like herself again before she called Patricia. She asked Adrian, "Do you understand what I'm describing?" "Yes," he said. "I understand exactly what you're describing. Because I need you to understand that I am not confused," she said. And there was something in her voice when she said it. Something that had been compressed and pressurized over months of being told the opposite. And she heard it herself and steadied. "They told the staff I was confused. They noted it in my file. I saw my own file. I managed to see it once when someone left it on the nursing station unattended, and there was a notation about cognitive concerns and a recommendation for increased monitoring. I am 73 years old, and I taught reading comprehension to children for 31 years, and I have never once in my life been confused about what I was observing." "I believe you," Adrian said. She looked at him. He said it again. "I believe you, Mrs. Whitman." Clara looked down at her soup, which she had barely touched in the past several minutes. She picked up her spoon and ate, and the warmth of the broth moved through her with something that felt embarrassingly like relief, which was not an emotion she had let herself feel in a very long time, because hope and relief were connected to each other in ways that made both of them dangerous when you had been in the position she had been in. She had told him almost everything. Not quite everything. There were parts of the notebook she had not yet described, because the further she had gotten into the timeline, the more serious the entries became, and she needed him to have the foundation before she placed the heavier things on top of it. "Mrs. Whitman?" Adrian said. His voice had shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but more careful. "The medical bracelet on your wrist." Clara looked down at it. The bracelet was simple silver-toned metal, with a small panel engraved with her blood type and the name of the medication she took for her blood pressure. "It's just a medical alert bracelet," she said. "I see that. But the name engraved on the other side." She turned her wrist. On the reverse of the panel, in letters too small to read easily from more than a foot away, was a name she'd had engraved there herself years ago at the insistence of someone who had said it would be important someday. A name she thought about on days when she was trying to decide whether to keep going or give up. The name was Margaret. She watched Adrian's face. "Margaret Serrano," he said quietly, and his voice had changed again, had become something she had not expected to find in him. Something that sounded like the very specific kind of grief that belongs to a promise that was made to someone who is no longer there to know whether it was kept. "You knew her," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "She was my mother's friend," Adrian said. "For 30 years. She was the woman who taught me to read because my mother was working 2 jobs and didn't have time. And Margaret Serrano lived 2 floors up and had been a teacher herself, and she sat with me every afternoon from the time I was 5 until I was 9. And she said—" He stopped. He picked up his water glass and set it down without drinking. "She said a person who could read was a person who could never truly be trapped," he said, "because their mind would always be free, even if everything else wasn't." Clara's throat tightened. "Margaret was my friend," she said. "For 43 years. I know. She talked about you. She died 2 years ago." "I know that too. She made me promise," Clara said, "that if I was ever truly in trouble, I should find someone she trusted and tell them everything. She told me your name. She told me where you were." She looked at him steadily. "I didn't plan on walking in here tonight. I was just cold, and I was hungry, and this was the first light I found. But when I saw the name on the door—" "You walked in?" "I walked in." The restaurant had slowly, over the course of their conversation, returned to something resembling its normal noise level. Not completely. There was still an awareness in the room, a peripheral attention directed at their table, that Clara could feel the way you can feel sunlight through a window even when you're not looking at it. But the most acute silence had passed, and the other diners had resumed their meals and their conversations with the slightly studied normalness of people who are pretending they haven't just witnessed something they don't entirely understand. One of the men from Adrian's original table appeared at a respectful distance. He didn't approach. He simply appeared and Adrian glanced at him, and the man made a small gesture that communicated something Clara couldn't read. Adrian looked back at her. "Mrs. Whitman, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, because what happens next depends on what you tell me." "I've been answering you honestly," she said. "I know you have. The question is this: the notebook, the evidence you've been collecting. How specific is it? Names, dates, documentation, or observations?" Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened the notebook to a page toward the middle and turned it so he could read it. He leaned forward. He read for almost 2 full minutes without speaking. Clara watched his face while he read the way she used to watch her students' faces when they encountered a text that was genuinely challenging them, looking for the moment when comprehension and consequence connected. When he looked up, his expression had changed in a way that was final and settled the way a decision looks when it has been made and isn't going to be revisited. "Where did you get the records on page 16? He asked. "From the nursing station. Late one night, when the aide on duty fell asleep. I photographed them with my telephone." "You photographed medical records. I photographed documents that I believed were evidence of a crime. I have been a law-abiding person my entire life, Adrian." She said his name for the first time, and registered without dwelling on it that it came naturally. "But I have also been a teacher, and I know what it looks like when children are being harmed in a place that's supposed to protect them. These are not children, but it is the same thing." He closed the notebook. "How many people know you've left Rosewood Haven?" "By now, everyone. They would have noticed at dinner." "Which means Halston knows by now." "Almost certainly." Adrian sat back. He turned his head slightly and looked at nothing specific, the particular focus of a person running through a series of calculations very quickly. Clara had seen that look before, not on a man like this, but in the same essential form. It was the look of someone whose job it was to keep track of many moving pieces simultaneously, which was at bottom what teaching had been. "All right," he said finally. He said it the way you say a thing, when you have reached the end of deliberation and arrived at resolve. "All right," Clara said, and she wasn't agreeing with anything specific. She was simply acknowledging that something had been decided, and that she was part of whatever came next, and that she was for the first time in 8 months, not alone in a room with a door that didn't fully lock. She finished her soup. She ate every drop, and when the waiter brought a second bowl without being asked, she looked up at Adrian, who was looking down at his phone, with the particular focused stillness of a man putting certain things in motion. And she picked up her spoon and started in on the second bowl too, because she was 73 years old, and she had learned a long time ago that you eat when the food is in front of you, because you never know with any certainty when it will be there again. In the kitchen, a young woman named Sophia Bennett was clearing a table near the service window, close enough to have heard fragments of the conversation at Adrian Moretti's table. Not everything, but enough. She had heard the name Rosewood Haven. She had heard Victor Halston's name spoken in a particular tone that made her hand stop moving for a moment over the dishes she was stacking. She stood very still. Then she went to the back and sat down on a milk crate near the walk-in and pressed her hands against her knees to stop them from shaking. Her mother had been at Rosewood Haven. Her mother had been at Rosewood Haven for 11 months before they called Sophia to say that Eleanor Bennett had passed away peacefully in her sleep. Sophia had been 26 years old and working double shifts, and too exhausted and too broke and too far from understanding how the world actually worked to know what questions to ask. She had signed the documents they put in front of her. She had thanked the staff for their kindness. She had arranged a small funeral and gone back to work because there was no other option. She had been asking questions about her mother ever since. Quietly. In the background of her life, in whatever time was left over after surviving, she had been looking for answers she didn't know how to find. She picked up her phone. She put it back down. She went back to work. but she did not stop listening. Victor Halston was at that moment in his office on the 43rd floor of a building on Michigan Avenue, and he was on the phone with the director of Rosewood Haven. And his voice was the voice of a man who does not raise his volume because he has never needed to, because the people around him have learned that a quiet voice from this particular man carries a weight that a shouted one from anyone else does not approach. "How did she get out?" he said. "We don't know exactly, Mr. Halston. The aide on the evening shift." "I don't care about the aide on the evening shift. I care about where Clara Whitman is right now." A pause. "We believe she may have gone toward the restaurant district. She mentioned once that she used to go to dinner in that area with—" "Find her," Victor said. "Before morning." He set down the phone. He walked to his window and looked out at the city which spread below him, in the particular way cities look at night from high buildings, which is simultaneously vast and precise. All those lights that are all those individual lives. And from here, you could believe that you had some purchase on all of it. Some arrangement with the way things worked that gave you a view the people below did not have. Victor Halston had spent 20 years building that view. He was not going to let a 73-year-old former schoolteacher take it apart. He made another call, and in Moretti's restaurant on West Erie Street, Adrian Moretti was making calls of his own, and Clara Whitman was finishing her soup, and Sophia Bennett was clearing tables, with her hands still not entirely steady, and outside the temperature had dropped another 2 degrees, and the city moved around all of them the way cities do, indifferent, enormous, full of things happening that no single person could see all of at once, each one carrying its own small weight of consequence forward into the next hour, and the one after that. The night was not over. It was in fact barely beginning. Adrian made 4 phone calls in the time it took Clara to finish her second bowl of soup, and none of them lasted more than 90 seconds. That was the thing about men who operated at his level, they didn't explain. They stated. And the people on the other end of the line had long since learned that a statement from Adrian Moretti was the end of a conversation, not the beginning of a negotiation. When he set his phone down the final time, he looked across the table at Clara, with the particular steadiness of someone who has made a series of decisions and intends to stand behind every one of them. "You're not going back tonight," he said. Clara set down her spoon. "I wasn't planning to." "You're not going back at all." She looked at him carefully. "Adrian, I'm a 73-year-old woman who walked out of a care facility without permission. Legally, depending on what paperwork Victor Halston has managed to put in front of a judge, they may have the right to— let me worry about what they have the legal right to do," he said. "I've been worrying about it for 4 months. I'm not sure I know how to stop. Then let me take some of it." He leaned forward slightly. "You came here tonight because Margaret told you to find me if you were ever truly in trouble. You told me you're in trouble. I'm telling you, I'm going to handle it. But I need you to trust me, and trust takes a decision, so I'm asking you to make one right now." Clara was quiet for a moment. Outside, a gust of wind hit the front window hard enough that she felt it in her teeth, or imagined she did. 11 degrees and dropping. "All right," she said. "I trust you." "Good." He stood. "Then let's move." He walked her through the kitchen, not through the front door, and Clara noticed that the staff parted around them without being asked, without confusion, with the particular fluid efficiency of people who have learned to read this man's movements and adjust to them without being directed. The kitchen was loud and bright and smelled overwhelmingly of garlic and hot oil, and Clara moved through it with her hand on her coat pocket, her fingers confirming for the 1,000th time that the notebook was still there, that it was real, that the past 4 months had not been something she'd imagined. The young woman buzzing tables near the service window, she caught Clara's eye for a fraction of a second as they passed. Something in that look stopped Clara for just a moment. Recognition almost. Not of Clara specifically, but of something in her situation, the way people sometimes recognize a feeling in a stranger's face, because they have carried the same one. Clara turned her head as Adrian guided her toward the back exit, but the young woman had already looked away back to her work, and there was no time to stop. The car waiting in the alley behind the restaurant was black and unremarkable, and the man behind the wheel had the face of someone who asked no questions about where he was driving or why. Clara got in. Adrian got in beside her. The door closed. The city moved past the windows. "Where are we going?" Clara asked. "Somewhere safe." "That's not a specific answer." "It's a specific outcome," he said. "Sometimes that's more important." She considered that. "You sound like someone who's had to make that argument before." "Many times." A pause. "Usually to people who would have been better off accepting the outcome and trusting the process." "And were they?" "Some of them." He looked out the window. Some of them weren't. Clara didn't ask him to elaborate on that. She had the sense developing more clearly with every passing minute that Adrian Moretti was a man who occupied a complicated position in the world, and that the complications were ones he had not stumbled into accidentally, but had made a series of choices to enter, and that whatever his reasons were, they were his own, and he was not the kind of man who explained himself without being asked directly, and sometimes not even then. What she did know, and what she held on to, as the car moved through the city, was this: he had stood up. When the whole room had looked away, when the manager had been deciding how quickly to remove her, when the men at their expense account dinners had found something fascinating to study on their plates, Adrian Moretti had stood up and walked across his own restaurant and pulled out a chair. You could spend a long time analyzing a person. You could look for explanations and motives in history. Or you could watch what they did when they didn't have to do anything, and that would tell you most of what you needed to know. She watched the city move past the window and held her coat pocket and breathed. They arrived at a brownstone on a quiet street in Lincoln Park, and Clara was shown to a room on the second floor by a woman in her 50s named Rosa, who asked no unnecessary questions, and had a guest room prepared with the particular efficiency of someone who kept things ready for contingencies, which Clara suspected was exactly what this was. The room had a good mattress and clean sheets, and a small bathroom and a window with a street view. And for the first time in 8 months, Clara was in a room where the door locked from the inside and the key was in her hand. She sat on the edge of the bed. She opened the notebook. She turned to a page near the back, one she had not shown Adrian, one she had been trying to decide what to do with since the night 3 weeks ago, when she had realized what she was actually looking at. The names on that page were not just residents. They were not just staff. 2 of the names on that page were men whose photographs she had seen in newspapers. Men whose decisions touched the lives of millions of people in this city every day. Men whose offices were in buildings with marble lobbies and security desks and American flags in the entryways. She had known for 3 weeks that what she was carrying was not just evidence of a crime against elderly people. It was a map to something much larger. A network of arrangement and protection and carefully maintained silence that explained why Victor Halston had never once in his 20 years of operation been investigated, audited, or questioned by anyone with the authority to do any of those things. She closed the notebook. She lay back on the bed with her coat still on and stared at the ceiling, and thought about Margaret Serrano, who had died 2 years ago, and who had told her 6 months before she died, when they were sitting on Clara's porch with coffee, and the particular unhurried quality of an afternoon between people who have known each other long enough that silence is as comfortable as speech. That there are moments in a life when you find yourself in possession of something that is too important to protect alone, and too dangerous to share carelessly. Margaret had said, "When that moment comes, you'll know. And you'll know who to trust." Clara hadn't known what she was talking about. She had assumed it was one of Margaret's occasionally cryptic philosophical statements, the kind she made sometimes that you filed away without quite understanding them, and didn't take out again until something happened that made them suddenly sharp and clear. She knew now. She closed her eyes. She intended to rest for a few minutes. Instead, she slept for 6 hours deeply, and without dreaming the sleep of a person whose body has been waiting for permission to rest and has finally received it. It was the first sound deep sleep she'd had in 8 months. Downstairs, Adrian was not sleeping. He was at the kitchen table with his laptop and 3 phones and a legal pad. And across from him sat a man named Dominic Reyes, who had been his closest associate for 15 years, and who had the ability which Adrian valued enormously to deliver bad news without preamble or softening. Dominic set a folder on the table. "How bad?" Adrian said. Depends on your definition of bad. Dominic opened the folder. Victor Halston has a sitting judge on his payroll. Judge Francis DeLuca, 3rd Circuit. He has 2 aldermen and 1 state senator, who have received over the past 4 years a combined total of roughly $300,000 in what the paper trail calls consulting fees from a shell company registered in Delaware that traces back with some effort to Rosewood Haven's parent LLC. Adrian was quiet. There's more, Dominic said. There always is. The disappearances. The residents who died at Rosewood Haven under circumstances that were never fully investigated. We found 9. That's confirmed, not estimated. 9 people whose deaths were signed off by a physician named Gerald Park, who is not board certified in geriatrics, has had his license under review twice in the past decade, and whose home address is a 20-minute drive from a property co-owned by Victor Halston. Adrian set down his pen. He had been writing notes. He stopped writing notes. 9 people, he said. 9 people that we've confirmed so far. There may be more. Adrian stood up. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to Dominic for a moment, looking at nothing, which was what he did when he was deciding something, when he was running the calculation all the way to its end. The old woman has a notebook, he said. What's in it? Names, dates. She photographed medical records. She has documentation going back 4 months of things that happen inside that facility. Medication changes, deaths, family members being blocked from contact, financial coercion. He paused. And something else. 2 names at the back that I need to look at more carefully. Dominic was quiet for a moment. Adrian, if Halston has the kind of protection you're describing, if we're talking about judges and politicians, then going at him directly, going at him legally, is going to be like pushing on a door that's been bolted from 12 different sides. I know that. So, what are you thinking? Adrian turned from the window. I'm thinking that the bolts don't matter if you take the door off its hinges. He sat back down. He pulled his laptop closer. He made a call. The person who picked up on the 3rd ring was a woman named Catherine Holt, and she was not a person that Adrian would normally call at 11:30 at night about anything, because she was a federal prosecutor in the Northern District of Illinois. And their relationship was one of those careful, complicated arrangements that exists in certain cities between certain people. A kind of armed understanding, where both sides know enough about the other to do significant damage, and both sides have also, over years of proximity, developed something that is not quite trust, but is adjacent to it. This is unusual, she said when she heard his voice. I have something for you, he said. If you're about to offer me something that will require me to ask how you obtained it, I'm going to refer you to an eyewitness, he said. A credible one. 73 years old, retired schoolteacher, 31 years in the Chicago public school system, no criminal record, all her faculties completely intact. She has 4 months of documented evidence about Victor Halston and Rosewood Haven that you are going to want to hear. A silence. Halston, she said. Halston. Another silence. Longer. I've had Halston on a back burner for 2 years. Nothing I could get traction on. Too many layers. The layers are documented, Adrian said, including some names that are going to make your evening considerably more interesting. He heard her exhale. What do you want in exchange? Nothing you'd expect, he said. The woman's safety and the guarantee that she is treated as a cooperating witness, not a source. She testifies in her own name. She gets credit for what she found. A pause. That's it. That's it. Adrian. Her voice shifted slightly. Are you doing a good deed? Don't make it strange, he said. She almost laughed. Not quite. Send me what you have. I'll look at it tonight. He hung up. Dominic was looking at him with the expression of a man who has known someone for 15 years and is still occasionally surprised by them. Don't, Adrian said. I wasn't going to say anything. You were thinking it loudly. Dominic picked up his coffee. What happens tomorrow, when Halston's people come looking for her? They'll come here first. That's why she's not going to be here. He turned back to his laptop. By morning, I want to know every judge, every politician, Every official who has taken money from Halston or from his shell companies. I want a complete picture of how wide this is before we move on any of it, because I am not going to hand Catherine Holt half a case. And the Dr. Gerald Park. Adrian considered. Find out if he has a family. Dominic raised an eyebrow. I want to know if he's a man who has something to lose, Adrian said. Not because I intend to threaten him. Because a man with something to lose is a man who will consider his position when someone lays the full weight of it in front of him and asks him to make a different choice. Dominic nodded slowly. All right. And Dominic. Adrian looked up. 9 people. I want their names. Every one of them. I want to know who their families are and whether those families ever got an explanation. Dominic picked up this folder. I'll have it by morning. He left. Adrian sat alone at the kitchen table and poured himself a measure of scotch he didn't drink and stared at the legal pad he'd been filling all those names and dates and amounts and connections, all those threads of a network that someone had spent 20 years carefully building and carefully hiding. And he thought about Harold Briggs, who was an engineer, and Beverly Marsh, whose daughter had been blocked from seeing her, and 9 people whose names he was going to know by morning, and an old woman upstairs who had spent 4 months in a locked facility writing down everything she saw in a pocket notebook and sleeping with it in her pillowcase, because it was the only way she could think of to make sure someone eventually knew the truth. He thought about Margaret Serrano, who had lived 2 floors above his mother's apartment and who had sat with him every afternoon and taught him to read because his mother was working and couldn't, who had told him that a person who could read was a person who could never truly be trapped. Margaret had known Clara Whitman for 43 years and had trusted her enough to give her his name. That said something. That said something significant about both of them. He picked up his phone one more time. He sent a text to a number he didn't have saved under any name, just a string of digits. The text said, I need to know everything about Rosewood Haven's staffing changes in the past 18 months. Specifically, any employees who left suddenly or were let go. The reply came back in under 4 minutes. That was another thing about operating at this level. Certain people were always awake. He read the reply. He set the phone down. He picked up his scotch and finally drank. 3 employees had been terminated from Rosewood Haven in the past 18 months with no stated reason. 1 had moved out of state. 1 could not be located. The 3rd was a young woman named Sophia Bennett, 28 years old, currently employed as a waitress at Moretti's restaurant on West Erie Street. Adrian stared at the name. Then he looked up at the ceiling in the direction of nothing specific and said nothing out loud, but felt the particular sensation of something that had seemed like coincidence, resolving into something that was anything but. Sophia Bennett was working in his restaurant. Sophia Bennett had been inside Rosewood Haven. Sophia Bennett's mother had been Eleanor Bennett, listed in the Rosewood Haven records as a resident who had died 18 months ago. He looked at his watch. It was nearly midnight. She would have finished her shift by now. He picked up his phone. In an apartment 3 miles away, Sophia Bennett was sitting on her kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet under the sink, which was where she went when things got to be too much, which was not often, but was tonight. Because she had heard the name Rosewood Haven in the restaurant, and she had heard Victor Halston's name, and she had been holding herself together through the rest of her shift with the particular controlled tension of a wire pulled too tight. And now that she was home, and it was just her and the quiet of her apartment, the tension had released, and she was on the kitchen floor. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown number, text message. The text said, My name is Adrian Moretti. You worked at Rosewood Haven. Your mother was Eleanor Bennett. I think you know what happened there, and I think you've been trying to find out for 18 months. I need to meet with you. Tonight, if possible. If not tonight, first thing tomorrow. There is a woman in my care right now who knew things your mother never got the chance to tell anyone. I believe together you might be able to finish what she started. Sophia read it twice. Her hands were not steady. She typed back, How do I know you're who you say you are? The reply was immediate. You saw us leave together through the kitchen tonight. You looked at her face. You recognized something. I saw you recognize it. That is why I'm texting you." Sophia sat on the kitchen floor for a long moment. Then she typed, "When and where?" The morning came in fast and cold. The kind of Chicago morning in January that announces itself without apology. And with it came, as Adrian had known they would, two men from Rosewood Haven. They arrived at the restaurant at 8:30, before opening hours, and they arrived with the polished surface of legitimate concern. "We're here about one of our residents. We believe she may have come here last night. We're very worried about her well-being." The man who met them at the door was not Adrian. It was a large, quiet man named Thomas, who had worked for Adrian for 11 years and who had a particular way of filling a doorway that made further conversation feel unnecessary. "She's not here," Thomas said. "We have reason to believe. She's not here," Thomas said again. The two men looked at Thomas for a moment. They reassessed something. They left. 20 minutes later, Adrian's phone rang. The number was one he recognized. Victor Halston was not a man he had spoken to often, but they had met twice, at the kind of events this city produced. Charity galas, ribbon cuttings, the theater of civic life, and the number was in his phone. From an exchange that had been deliberately careful and mutually cautious, two men circling each other at a careful distance. He let it ring. Victor left a voicemail. The voicemail said in a voice that was precisely calibrated to sound like reasonable concern, "Adrian, I understand one of our residents came to your restaurant last night. Mrs. Whitman is a lovely woman, but she's been experiencing some significant confusion, and her family is very worried. I hope we can resolve this quickly and quietly. I'm sure you understand. Call me." Adrian listened to it once. He did not call back. He was at that moment sitting across a table from Sophia Bennett, who had arrived at the brownstone at 7 in the morning, with shadows under her eyes and a backpack over one shoulder, and the look of someone who had made a decision and was holding it with both hands. Clara was at the table too, dressed in clothes Rosa had found for her, and the two women had looked at each other for the first time. And something had happened in that look that Adrian could see, but not entirely name. A recognition not of each other specifically, but of a shared experience, the particular knowledge of what it felt like to be inside that building. "Your mother," Clara said. "Eleanor." Sophia's jaw tightened. "Yes." "She was in the room next to mine for 3 months." Sophia went very still. "She was a wonderful woman," Clara said. "She talked about you constantly. She had a photograph of you on her nightstand. She told me you called every week without fail." Clara's voice was steady and careful. "I want you to know that she was not alone. She had friends in that place who cared about her. I cared about her. And I want you to know that I have written down everything I observed during the time she was there, because I didn't know how to get it out, but I knew it needed to get out." Sophia's eyes were bright. Her hands were flat on the table. "She didn't die of natural causes," Sophia said. "It was not a question. She said it the way you say something you've been carrying for so long that it has worn grooves into you, something you've known, without being able to prove something that has been making you feel like you were losing your mind because everyone around you kept telling you that you were wrong." "I don't have medical certainty," Clara said carefully. "I am not a nurse and I cannot make that determination. But what I can tell you is that in the 2 weeks before your mother died, her medication was adjusted twice by Dr. Gerald Park, and the changes were not documented in the way that changes of that significance should have been documented. And I can tell you that 2 other residents died within 3 weeks of your mother, both under Dr. Park's care, both following medication adjustments, and in both cases, the families were contacted only after the fact." Sophia pressed her hands harder against the table. "I've been trying to get someone to listen to me for 18 months, she said. "I went to the state health department. They investigated and found no violations. I went to a lawyer who told me the case wasn't strong enough. I filed a complaint with the medical board about Dr. Park and received a form letter telling me the matter was under review." She stopped. "I started working at your restaurant because I heard that Adrian Moretti had some connection to the building where Rosewood Haven's parent company is registered. I didn't have a plan exactly. I just needed to be somewhere closer to someone who might actually have enough weight to push. Adrian looked at her. You took that job to get to me. Sophia met his eyes. Yes. He studied her for a moment. That took a significant amount of patience. I've been patient for 18 months, she said. I'm out of patience. I need someone to do something. Something in the air at the table shifted. Clara was watching both of them with the particular attention of someone who has spent a lifetime reading rooms. Show her the notebook, Adrian said. Clara opened it to the section on Eleanor Bennett. She turned it to face Sophia. Sophia read for a long time. Her breathing changed as she read, not dramatically, but in the small ways breathing changes when something lands, when a thing you believed without proof becomes a thing that has shape and weight and detail. When she looked up, her eyes were dry, which was somehow more significant than if they hadn't been. Page 37, Clara said quietly. I documented the conversation I had with your mother 4 days before she died. She told me she had tried to reach you, and the call hadn't gone through. She asked me to remember something for her, in case she didn't get another chance to say it herself. Sophia's hands curled slowly on the table. Clara reached across and placed her own hand over Sophia's. She said to tell you that you were the best thing she ever did, Clara said. She said you got your stubbornness from her and she was proud of it. Sophia closed her eyes. No one spoke. After a moment, Sophia opened her eyes. She exhaled slowly. She looked at Adrian. What do we do? She said. We build the case, Adrian said. All the way. Every piece, every name, every document, every piece of testimony. And then we hand it to the right person and we let it burn. Victor has protection, Sophia said. I found that out in the first month. He has people. We know who he has, Dominic said from across the room, because Dominic had been there the whole time, and Sophia had simply not focused on him until now, a quality he cultivated. He set a folder on the table. And we know what they're worth and what they're afraid of. Sophia looked at the folder. How do you have all this? Because I asked the right questions of the right people last night, Adrian said. This could put people in danger, she said. She was looking at Clara when she said it. It will, Adrian said, and he didn't soften. It didn't cushion it, didn't make it sound easier than it was, because that was not the kind of man he was, and this was not a moment for comfortable lies. That's why we're going to move quickly and thoroughly, and why Clara is not going back to that facility and is not going anywhere near Halston or his people until this is over. Clara had been listening to all of this with her hands folded on the notebook and her back straight. I'm 73, she said. I've been taking care of myself for most of those years. I'm not interested in being managed. I'm not managing you, Adrian said. I'm protecting you. There's a difference. Ask me again in 2 weeks, he said. Clara considered him. Then she unfolded her hands and slid the notebook across the table to Adrian. Pages 40 through 44, she said. I haven't shown you those yet. He opened to the page. He read. The room was very quiet. When he looked up, his expression was the one she had seen the night before, that final, settled look of a decision made and not going to be revisited. This changes the size of it, he said. Yes, Clara said. This is not just Halston. No, Clara said. It never was. Sophia looked between them. What's on those pages? Adrian closed the notebook. He looked at Sophia, then at Clara, then back at Sophia. He was running his calculation again. Clara could see it, the same rapid interior accounting she had watched him perform the night before, weighing what to say against what it would cost to say it. There are 2 names in the back of this notebook, he said. A judge and a state senator. And the documentation suggests their arrangement with Halston didn't just involve money, it involved active intervention, blocking investigations, redirecting complaints. And in at least one case, there is a suggestion, not proof, but a strong suggestion, that one of those men was made aware of what was happening to residents at that facility and chose to protect Halston rather than act. Sophia sat back. So, we're not going to the state health department, she said. No. We're not going to the medical board. No. We're going federal, she said. We're already federal, Adrian said. I made that call last night. Victor Halston's second call came at 11 that morning. This one was not a voicemail. It was a text to a number he should not have had, which told Adrian that Victor had resources Adrian had not yet fully mapped, which was information in itself useful and important. The text said, "You are making a serious mistake. Clara Whitman is not who you think she is. She is a deeply confused woman who has been mismanaging her medications for months and constructing elaborate narratives. I have medical documentation. I am trying to help her. All I'm asking is that you let us bring her home." Adrian read it. He thought about Harold Briggs, who had been an engineer for 40 years and who had been gone from behind his own eyes before Victor Halston's people were done with him. He thought about Eleanor Bennett, who had a photograph of her daughter on her nightstand and who had asked Clara to carry a message out in case she didn't get another chance to send it herself. He typed back 3 words and sent them. "She's not coming." He put his phone in his pocket. Across the table, Sophia was looking at Clara, and Clara was looking back at her, and between them on the table was the notebook. And outside, the city was doing what it always did, moving and grinding and going about its business. And somewhere in a building on Michigan Avenue, Victor Halston was reading 3 words on a screen and understanding for the first time that he had made a miscalculation. He had spent 20 years building a structure of protection and arrangement and carefully maintained silence, and he had grown so confident in it that he had stopped accounting for the variables that structures like his always eventually encounter: the person who refuses to be intimidated, the detail that gets written down when no one is watching. The name passed from one old woman to another on a porch on a summer afternoon 6 months before one of them died. He had not accounted for Clara Whitman. He had not accounted for the fact that she slept with her notebook in her pillowcase for 4 months and walked 40 minutes in 11-degree weather to find the one door she had been told to find. And he had not accounted for what happens when a man who has spent his life operating in the dark makes the mistake of becoming someone else's problem. That was the miscalculation. And it was the kind you don't get to make twice. They put Clara in a room on the 2nd floor of a townhouse on Dearborn Street that belonged to a woman named Rosa, who was Adrian's cousin, and who opened the door at 2 in the morning without asking a single question, looked at Clara's wet shoes and said, "Come in. Sit down. I'll get you dry socks." With the matter-of-fact warmth of someone for whom hospitality was not a performance, but simply the way things were done. Clara sat at Rosa's kitchen table and accepted the socks and a cup of chamomile tea and called Patricia from a phone Adrian placed in front of her, a clean one, he said, meaning one that no one was monitoring, and she did not fully understand the mechanics of how he knew that. But she understood that he did know, and that was sufficient. Patricia answered on the 2nd ring, even though it was after midnight in Seattle, which meant she had not been sleeping, which meant she had been waiting in the specific way you wait when you are afraid and trying not to show it to yourself. "Mom." The word came out in a single compressed syllable that contained about 14 different emotions. "Mom, I have been calling Rosewood Haven since yesterday afternoon. They told me you were resting. They told me you were unavailable. They told me 3 different things, and none of them were the same, and I was about to get on a plane." "I'm safe," Clara said. "I'm safe, Patricia. I need you to listen to me." She kept it short. She kept it accurate. She told Patricia the essential facts, and she told her about the envelope, and she told her to open it only if she did not hear from Clara within 3 days, because the situation was moving, and she needed Patricia to trust her, and not to do anything that would alert anyone at Rosewood Haven that the family was alarmed. Patricia was quiet for a moment after Clara finished. Then she said, "Who is this person you're with? This Adrian Moretti?" "He was a friend of Margaret's," Clara said. Another pause. Patricia had known Margaret Serrano her whole childhood, had called her Aunt Margaret without any actual biological claim to the title, had cried at her funeral. "Margaret's friend," she said, and Clara could hear her working through the implications of that description. "Mom, are you sure?" "I am sure," Clara said. "Get some sleep. I will call you tomorrow." She hung up and sat with her hands around the tea and did not say anything for a moment. Rosa, who was maybe 50 and had the kind of face that looks like it has seen a great deal and chosen to be kind anyway, refilled her cup without being asked. "The guest room is upstairs," she said. "It's made up. The door locks from the inside." Clara looked at her. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just sleep." Sophia was in the living room with Adrian, and Clara could hear their voices without making out the words, the low, fast back and forth of people planning rather than talking. She could hear the particular rhythm of it, the pauses that meant someone was writing something down, the moments where one voice went quiet to let the other complete a thought. She recognized that rhythm. She had sat in enough planning sessions over 31 years to know what it sounded like when people were building something rather than just discussing it. She finished her tea. She went upstairs. The room was small and clean, and the bed had 3 blankets on it, because someone had understood that a woman who had been out in 11-degree weather for hours would need warmth that went beyond what a single blanket provided. Clara took off her coat and hung it on the back of the door, and looked at it for a moment. The thin tan wool, the missing buttons, the strip of pillowcase fabric at the waist. She had worn that coat for 3 years. She would need a better one. She added this to the list of things she would deal with when there was time, a list that had been growing since the previous evening and showed no signs of shortening yet. She took the notebook out of the coat pocket. She put it under the pillow. Then she lay down on top of the blankets for a moment, just to test whether she was actually tired enough to sleep, or whether her mind was going to do the thing it sometimes did, the thing where it produced with great clarity and no particular mercy every unanswered question and unresolved problem available to it at that moment. She had a long-standing and not entirely successful negotiation going with her own mind about this. She was asleep in 4 minutes. Across the city at that same hour, Victor Halston was not sleeping. He was sitting in his office with a glass of something he wasn't drinking, and on the table in front of him were 2 photographs. One was a picture of Clara Whitman that had been taken from Rosewood Haven's intake files, a formal photograph from the day she arrived. Her hair neat, her expression the careful neutral of someone sitting for an official picture. The other photograph was of the front of Moretti's restaurant on West Erie Street, taken from street level, the kind of photograph that someone takes when they want to document a location rather than remember it. His assistant, a man named Burke, who had been with him for 11 years, was standing near the window. "She was in there for almost 3 hours, Victor said. "Yes." "And Moretti sat with her the entire time." "Confirmed." "And then they left together." "Together with one of the waitstaff. Female. We're running her now." Victor set down the glass he hadn't been drinking from. He was 61 years old, and he had the particular grooming of a man who has equated his appearance with his authority for so long that maintaining it had become automatic, something he did not think about, the way he did not think about breathing. His suits were made in Milan. His office smelled of leather and paper and the specific neutrality of expensive air filtration. Everything around him communicated the same message, which was that chaos happened to other people. He was feeling something he did not have a great deal of experience with. It was not quite fear. It was the thing that exists adjacent to fear in the mind of a person who has not been afraid in a long time. The recognition that a situation has properties that cannot be controlled through the usual means, which was fundamentally different from uncontrollable, which was a distinction Victor kept very clear. "The notebook," he said. "We don't know what's in it. We know she's been in that facility for 8 months, and she has not confused whatever the file says, and she had access to things she should not have had access to." He looked at the photograph of Clara's face. A schoolteacher, 31 years. They're systematic. They're organized. They're used to building a picture piece by piece and presenting it clearly. He turned the photograph face down on the table. She gave him the notebook. We don't know that for certain. She walked into his restaurant in the rain at 11 o'clock at night. She didn't walk in there for the soup. He looked at Burke. "I want to know everything about their connection. Moretti and the woman. There has to be one. We're looking. Look faster." He stood and walked to the window and looked at the city below him, and for the first time in a very long while the view did not give him the feeling it usually gave him, which was the feeling of a man standing at the correct elevation relative to everything that needed to be managed. "The federal angle," he said. Burke was quiet for a moment. "If Moretti goes to federal investigators, he won't go directly. He's too careful for that. He'll build something first, get the evidence clean, establish a position that puts him above any blowback." Victor turned from the window. "We have a narrow window while they're building." He looked at Burke. "I want inspectors at every Moretti-affiliated property by Thursday. Every license reviewed, every permit scrutinized. I want his lawyers busy." "That'll make it obvious we know." "I want it to be obvious. I want him to understand that engaging with this costs him. That is information he needs to have." He sat back down. "And I want Clara Whitman back in that facility. Not through force, through the right channels. Her file documents cognitive concerns, a physician's request for welfare check, a concerned facility director exercising a duty of care." Burke wrote something down. "Her daughter," Victor said. "Patricia Whitman, Seattle. We have her. Don't touch the daughter, that's a line." He said it without sentiment, just as a practical boundary. A daughter in Seattle is a sympathetic figure, and I don't need sympathetic figures. I need Clara Whitman discredited before whatever she gave Moretti can be verified. He looked at the turned-down photograph. "We have people who will say she was confused. We have a file that documents it. We have a facility director who will stand behind every notation." He paused. "What I need is for that to happen in the next 48 hours. Burke said, "I'll make the calls." Victor looked at the window. "Do that." The morning came in cold and bright, the overnight temperature having dropped further, so that the city looked sharp and precise in the way cities look when the air is dry enough that light travels without interruption. Clara woke at 6:15, which was when she had always woken, a habit from 3 decades of being at school by 7:30 that her body had kept long after she no longer needed it to. She lay still for a moment and ran through what she knew. The notebook was under her pillow. Patricia was in Seattle and not panicking. Sophia was somewhere in this house. Adrian had been putting things in motion since the previous evening, and the particular quality of the things he put in motion, the speed, the precision, the absence of wasted words, told her that he was a person who had been managing complex and dangerous situations for long enough that he had developed not just skills, but instincts, and that those instincts were in the current situation an asset she was genuinely grateful for. She was also aware of what she did not have. She did not have a lawyer. She did not have medical documentation of what had been done to Harold and Beverly and Thomas beyond what she had observed and noted. She did not have testimony from current staff at Rosewood Haven, none of whom would speak to her now that she had run. She did not have the financial transfer documents that showed exactly how much had moved from residents' accounts to the facility's trust. Or rather, she had references to those transfers in the notebook based on conversations and fragments she had been able to see, but not the documents themselves. She had a pattern. She needed proof. She got up, folded the blankets, and went downstairs. Adrian was already at Rosa's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a phone, and the expression of a man who had slept approximately 3 hours and had found that adequate. Sophia was across from him, with her hands around her own coffee, and there was a legal pad between them, with handwriting on it, that Clara recognized as fast and functional, the kind of notes people take when they're planning, rather than recording. "Good morning," Clara said. "Coffee's on the counter," Rosa called from somewhere deeper in the house. Clara poured a cup and sat down at the table. She looked at the legal pad. She looked at them. "Tell me," she said. Adrian turned the legal pad so she could read it. She read it top to bottom without interrupting. When she looked up, she said, "Midway Care Staffing." "How quickly?" "Sophia called her contact last night," Adrian said. "There's an opening at Rosewood Haven for a part-time overnight aide starting next Tuesday. The position was listed internally. It hasn't been posted publicly." 5 days, Clara said. 4.5. "That's a long time for Victor to move. It's also a long time for us to move." He turned the pad back toward him. "I have a federal contact. Not law enforcement directly, someone who works adjacent to the relevant investigation units and has reasons of their own to want Halston looked at. I'm meeting with them this afternoon. What you gave me last night is enough to get that meeting taken seriously. What Sophia brings back from inside is what turns a meeting into an action. Clara nodded. What about the reporter? Which reporter? I mailed an envelope to a reporter at the Tribune 2 nights ago from the mailbox on North Clark. If it arrived yesterday? Adrian looked at her with an expression that she had begun to learn, which was the expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of a situation upward. You did that before you walked into my restaurant. I did that before I walked out of Rosewood Haven, Clara said. I mailed 3 envelopes. I told you about 2 of them last night. The Tribune envelope contains copies of the most legible pages from the notebook and a typed summary I composed over the course of 4 evenings in my room. I wrote it on the notepad that came in the welcome packet when I arrived. Victor Halston's stationery effectively. A beat of silence. You did this on Halston's own stationery, Adrian said. It seemed appropriate. She picked up her coffee. The reporter's name is Dana Okafor. She wrote a 5-part series in 2021 about financial exploitation of elderly residents in care facilities in Cook County. I read it at the time, before everything, when I was simply a reader, and I thought it was one of the best reported series I had encountered in local journalism in years. She understands the system well enough to know where to look for what I'm describing. Sophia leaned forward. If the Tribune starts calling Rosewood Haven before we have the documents. I included a letter asking her to hold the story until she heard from me, or until 7 days passed. I gave her the number of the post office box Margaret established. Clara looked at Adrian. The same post office box I told you about. Which means if she goes there, she won't find a box that goes nowhere, Adrian said quietly. He looked at his coffee. Margaret set that box up as a secure relay point. Anything deposited there comes to me. He paused. Came to me. We kept it active after she died. Force of habit, or something like that. There was a silence at the table that was not uncomfortable, but had weight to it. She was thinking about this, Clara said. Margaret. She set that box up 15 years ago. She gave me the number 7 years ago when we were having one of those conversations that feel like hypotheticals but aren't entirely. She was thinking even then that there might come a time when someone needed exactly this. Clara looked at her cup. She was a very careful person. She was the most careful person I've ever known, Adrian said. And I've known careful people. Sophia looked between them. What was she to you beyond your mother's friend? Adrian was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone avoiding the question, but of someone choosing how to answer it accurately. She was the person who told me the truth, he said. Most people who are around someone like me, they tell you what you want to hear, or they stay quiet. Margaret Serrano told me the truth about myself, about the choices I was making, about what those choices cost. She did it without drama, without lecturing. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. The last time I saw her 8 months before she died, she told me that I was going to have to decide what I wanted to be remembered for. She wasn't talking about after I was dead. She was talking about now while I could still change the answer. The kitchen was quiet. Did you, Sophia asked, change the answer? I'm sitting here, he said. He picked up his phone, and the moment passed became the next moment, which was the moment where things needed to happen. By 9 o'clock that morning, government inspectors had arrived at 3 of Adrian Moretti's affiliated businesses. It happened with the particular simultaneity that told anyone who was paying attention that it was coordinated rather than coincidental. A parking structure on Wells Street, a logistics company in Pilsen, a restaurant supply distributor in the West Loop, inspectors with clipboards, and the careful expressions of people performing a function they understand is being used for a purpose that is not exactly its stated purpose. Adrian's lawyer, a woman named Catherine Voss, who had been representing him for 9 years and who greeted the news of 3 simultaneous inspections, the way a very experienced sailor greets a storm with complete focus and zero wasted energy, was on the phone with him by 9:15. He moved fast, she said. Faster than I expected, Adrian said. He was in Rosa's car moving toward a meeting on the north side. What's our exposure? Nothing that'll stick if the inspections are clean. 2 of those properties are clean. The distributor has a permit that expires in February that I've been telling you to renew since November. A pause that communicated clearly, and without words, exactly how she felt about that. I'll have it renewed by end of business today. Retroactively documented as in progress. Do that. What else? He's going to come at you publicly. The narrative you kidnapping an elderly resident acting against her welfare, interfering with a licensed care facility. He'll have a physician's welfare check request filed by this afternoon if he hasn't already. He already has, Adrian said. I had that confirmed an hour ago. So she needs to be seen, voluntarily publicly, not hiding. Adrian thought about this. I have an idea about that. Adrian. Catherine's voice changed slightly. This man has a judge in the 11th Circuit who owes him something significant. He has 2 county commissioners. He has the licensing board for care facilities sewn up so tight that a complaint goes in and gets closed before anyone with actual authority sees it. I know who you are, and I know what you're capable of, and I'm telling you as your lawyer that in this specific fight, the law is his weapon, and it is pointed at you. Whatever you're planning, it has to be cleaner than clean. It will be, he said. I mean it. Catherine, when have I ever given you a reason not to mean it? She made a sound that managed to communicate simultaneously both professional respect and profound exasperation. I'll have someone at the properties by 10. He hung up and looked at the city moving past the window and thought about Clara's notebook and about the doctor whose name appeared on page 16 and about the 3 residents who had died in 4 weeks and about the fact that somewhere in a filing system that Victor Halston believed was secure, there were pharmaceutical records that would turn Clara's careful observations into prosecutable evidence. He thought about Sophia, who was going into that building in 4 days. He thought about Margaret, who had built a relay point 15 years ago for a contingency she never spoke about directly, and he thought about what it meant that the contingency had arrived exactly as she had quietly, precisely prepared for it. He made another call. The man who answered was named Delaney, and he worked for a federal oversight body in a capacity that was not publicly described in detail on his agency's website, and he and Adrian had an understanding that was mutual and practical, and had never in 8 years required either of them to make explicit what it was based on. I need a meeting, Adrian said. I heard some inspectors paid you a visit this morning, Delaney said. He said it neutrally, but neutral from Delaney was informative. Victor Halston, Adrian said. Silence. How much do you have? Delaney asked. Enough to make the meeting worth your while. More coming in the next week. Another silence, longer, the kind where someone is running a calculation that involves factors Adrian was not entirely aware of. There's something you should know, Delaney said finally. Tell me. Halston has been on a watch list for 18 months. Financial Crimes Division. There's a file. The file has had some difficulty moving through the appropriate channels. Because he has people in the appropriate channels. That is not something I said. No, it isn't. Adrian watched a stoplight change. But if someone were to bring you evidence that made the file impossible to keep still, if someone were to do that, Delaney said carefully, the timing would need to be exact, and the evidence would need to be clean, completely clean. Nothing that can be characterized as obtained improperly. Understood. And Adrian. Delaney's voice dropped slightly. Whatever you're doing, be careful who you expose in that building. Some of the staff are in positions they didn't choose freely. Adrian said nothing for a moment. Then, I'll keep that in mind. Tonight, 7 o'clock, the place on Wabash. I'll be there. He hung up. The car turned north and Adrian sat back and let himself think through the shape of what was happening, which had moved in the past 12 hours from a crisis into something that had the beginnings of a structure. That was the transition that mattered from chaos into architecture. He had done it before. He knew what each phase felt like, and he knew where the danger in each phase lived. The danger right now was time. Victor was moving. His legal assault on Adrian's businesses was a delaying tactic as much as a pressure tactic designed to occupy Adrian's lawyers, and his attention and his resources, while Victor used the intervening time to build his own case against Clara. The welfare check request was the centerpiece of that. If a physician, a licensed physician with no visible connection to Halston, filed a formal welfare check request, stating that Clara Whitman was a vulnerable adult with documented cognitive concerns who had left a care facility against medical advice, then the machinery of the state could potentially be used to return her to Rosewood Haven. And once she was back inside those walls, the notebook was the only record, and Clara herself would be the person Halston had always said she was an elderly, confused woman with a grievance that stemmed from her own decline rather than from actual wrongdoing. Adrian understood this with the complete clarity that comes from spending a career watching people use systems against each other. He needed Clara visible and credible before the welfare check request could gain traction. He called Rosa. "How is she this morning?" he asked. "She is sitting at my kitchen table reading my newspaper, and she has found 2 factual errors in a front-page article, and she wants to know if she can write a letter to the editor," Rosa said. "Not yet. That's what I told her. She says she understands, but I can tell she's going to think of some way around it." "Put her on." A brief pause, then Clara's voice. "Good morning." "Good morning. I need to ask you something, and I need a completely honest answer." "When have I given you any other kind?" she said. "How are you physically?" "Not what you're going to tell your daughter. The truth." A pause that was shorter than he expected. "My joints ache. My left knee has been difficult since October. I am tired in the way that takes more than one night to fix." Another pause. "But I am functional. I am completely functional." "Good. Because I need you to do something today that is going to require you to be exactly that." He explained what he had in mind. When he finished, Clara was quiet for a moment. "You want me to be seen in public, speaking to someone credible. Someone credible and specific," he said. "Dana Okafor received your envelope yesterday. She contacted the post office box at 7 this morning. I heard from the relay point an hour ago. She's not sitting on it, she's moving." "She's a good reporter," Clara said with the tone of someone confirming a long-held assessment. "She wants to meet with you." "Then let's meet with her. It can't look arranged. It needs to look like something that happened naturally, because Halston's people will have the narrative locked in by this afternoon, and a reporter who meets with you after being arranged to do so by Adrian Moretti is a story with a complication. But a reporter who receives an envelope from a source and then tracks down that source on her own and meets with her in a public place, that's just journalism," Clara said. "Exactly. So you're not arranging the meeting," Clara said. "You're arranging the conditions under which the meeting can happen naturally. You understand? I've been teaching comprehension for 31 years, she said. I understand perfectly." She thought for a moment. "Dana Okafor's Tribune office is on Michigan Avenue. The coffee shop 2 blocks south of there has been open since 1987, and it's the kind of place where a reporter and a source could plausibly have found each other. I've been there." She paused. "I used to go there with Margaret." The line was quiet for a second. 11 o'clock, Adrian said. "Rosa will drive you." "All right." A pause. "Adrian, the welfare check request." "I know about it." "How long do we have before it creates a problem?" "If the filing moves at normal speed, 48 hours before anyone acts on it. But Halston has someone in the system who can accelerate it. So potentially less." "Potentially less," Clara said. Then 11 o'clock. She hung up and turned to Rosa, who was in the doorway of the kitchen, with the particular expression of someone who has been pretending not to listen while listening with complete attention. "I need to borrow a coat," Clara said. Rosa looked at the thin tan wool hanging on the back of the chair and did not say a single word about it. She went upstairs and came back with a wool coat in deep burgundy that was warm and well-made and fit Clara well enough in the shoulders that it would do. Clara put it on and looked at Rosa. "Thank you," she said. Rosa shook her head. "Don't thank me. Just make sure that man goes to prison." That, Clara said, is the plan. Meanwhile, Sophia was 3 miles away in her apartment, the one she had been afraid to go back to the night before, which Adrian's people had checked at 3 in the morning and declared clear sitting on her bed with her laptop open and a phone in her hand, and the particular focused calm of someone who has identified a course of action and is now executing it piece by piece. She had called her contact at Midway Care Staffing. The opening was real. An overnight aide position 2 nights a week to start with the possibility of additional shifts. The pay was modest. The requirements were a current CPR certification, which Sophia had, and a background check, which would go through the system in a particular way because of a particular arrangement Adrian had made the night before, that Sophia had not asked the details of, because some details were she had decided information she did not need. She would start Tuesday. 4 days. She looked at the photograph on her nightstand, the one of her and her mother from 3 Christmases ago, the last Christmas before the fall, before the rehabilitation, before Rosewood Haven, before the phone call. Her mother was laughing in the photograph with her whole face, the way some people laugh and some people don't, the way Eleanor Bennett had always laughed completely and without reserve. Sophia had spent 14 months being careful about what she said and who she said it to. Careful about how much of her grief she showed at work where she could not afford to be seen as someone who was not managing. Careful about the questions she asked and the way she asked them, because she had learned early that asking the wrong question in the wrong way closed doors faster than anything else. She was done being careful. She was going to go into Rosewood Haven, and she was going to find what she needed, and she was going to be smart about it, and she was going to come out, and what she brought out was going to be part of the thing that ended this. She closed her laptop. She lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling. "I'm going in, Mom," she said to the ceiling, to the photograph, to the particular frequency on which she still spoke to her mother sometimes when no one was around to hear. "I'm going to find out what happened. I'm going to bring it out." She lay there for another few minutes. Then she sat up because there was work to do, and she was the kind of person who, once she decided to do something, found staying still more difficult than moving. At 11 o'clock, in a coffee shop 2 blocks south of the Tribune offices on Michigan Avenue, Clara Whitman sat down across from Dana Okafor, who was 38 years old, and had the watchful economy of movement that belongs to journalists who have been in uncomfortable situations often enough that stillness has become a professional skill. She had Clara's envelope in a folder inside her bag, and she had read its contents 4 times. She looked at Clara. She said, "You're not confused." "No," Clara said, "I am not." Dana put the folder on the table. She opened it to the typed summary, 4 pages, Clara's handwriting from the notepad with Rosewood Haven's letterhead at the top. "Walk me through this," she said. "Everything, from the beginning." She had her phone out, the recorder running. Clara folded her hands on the table. She thought of 31 years of standing in front of children who needed her to be clear and organized and honest so that they could learn something true. She thought of Margaret Serrano, who had told her years ago that the right words to the right person at the right moment could do what nothing else could. She thought of Harold Briggs, who had been an engineer for 40 years and had opinions about architecture and baseball, and who had come to dinner one Thursday and was not Harold anymore. She began to speak, and at that same moment across the city, a man named Burke placed a phone call to a physician who owed Victor Halston a favor, and the physician, without examining Clara Whitman, or speaking to her, or knowing anything about her, beyond what Burke told him, signed a document expressing grave concern for her welfare, and requesting as a matter of medical urgency that she be located and returned to the care of Rosewood Haven Senior Center immediately. The document was filed electronically at 11:17. The clock that had already been running got shorter, and Clara Whitman sat in a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue and told the truth because it was the only thing she had ever known how to do, and because the truth properly placed with the right person was the only weapon she had ever needed. Donna Okafor's recorder had been running for 2 hours and 40 minutes when Clara finally stopped talking, not because she had run out of things to say, because she had said the things that mattered in the order they mattered, and she was a woman who understood the difference between complete and exhaustive, and had always aimed for the former. Dana sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the folder in front of her, which now had her own handwriting layered over Clara's typed pages, questions, arrows, circled names, the particular shorthand of a reporter who has been taking notes for 15 years and has developed a private language for the moment when a story becomes real rather than possible. The physician on page 3, Dana said. Dr. Kenneth Marsh. No relation to Beverly Marsh, Clara said immediately, because she had known that question was coming. I checked. He's the one who signed off on the medication adjustments for all 3 residents who died. He's the one whose signature appears on those adjustments. Whether he signed them knowingly and willingly, or whether his signature was on documents he did not fully review, that is a question I cannot answer from what I observed. I can only tell you what I saw. Dana looked at her. You're careful. I've had to be. Most people in your situation, they'd be telling me conclusions. You're giving me observations. I was a teacher, Clara said. I know the difference between evidence and inference. A student who presents an inference as evidence fails the assignment. It doesn't matter how right they are. Dana almost smiled. You'd make a good journalist. I made a good teacher, Clara said. That was enough. Dana closed the folder. She picked up her phone and stopped the recorder and looked at Clara with the direct, undecorated gaze of someone who needs to say something true and is taking a moment to make sure she says it right. I'm going to be honest with you, Dana said. What you've given me is enough to start. It's not enough to publish. What you described, the pattern, the timing, the medication changes, the financial transfers at all points in one direction. But Halston will produce a physician who says you're disoriented. He'll produce staff who'll say you were difficult and confused, and that your records are accurate. He will say this notebook is the product of an elderly woman's grievance dressed up as documentation. She paused. I need the pharmaceutical records. I need the financial transfer documents. I need someone inside who can confirm the pattern from primary sources. I know, Clara said. Do you have access to any of that? Not directly, but someone is going in Tuesday. Dana went still. Inside Rosewood Haven. As a staff member, she has personal reason and she knows what to look for. Dana looked at her for a long moment. This person understands the risk. She understands it completely. If Halston finds out someone is investigating from inside, she understands that too. Dana was quiet. Then she said, I want to meet her. I'll ask her. Dana put the folder in her bag and stood, then stopped. Mrs. Whitman, the welfare check request. You know about it. Clara looked up at her. I know about it. It was filed at 11:17 this morning. My source in the county system flagged it 30 minutes ago. Dana's voice was level informational, but underneath the information was something that might have been urgency. If they move on it in the next 24 hours, everything gets complicated. You become a missing, vulnerable adult rather than a witness. I know, Clara said. What time is it? 1:47. Then I have things to do, Clara said, and stood up and put on Rosa's burgundy coat and picked up her purse, in which the notebook lived now, because she had moved it from the coat pocket that morning, reasoning that the coat might be borrowed, but the purse was irrevocably hers. She paused at the table. Dana, she said. The 3 people who died. Harold Briggs, Beverly Marsh, Thomas Galecki. They were real people. Harold had opinions about baseball, and he told the same story about a bridge in a different way every time, so it never felt like a repeated story. Beverly's daughter drove from Evanston every Sunday without fail until they stopped her. Thomas set aside money for his grandchildren's educations. She looked at the reporter directly. I want you to remember that when this becomes a story about evidence and documents and financial fraud, the evidence matters because they mattered. Don't let the evidence be the story. Let them be the story. Dana Okafor, who had been a journalist for 15 years and had developed a thick professional skin because you needed one to do the work, looked at the 73-year-old woman standing across from her and felt something shift behind her sternum that she was going to have to sit with later in private. I won't, she said. Clara nodded and walked out. Outside, Rosa was waiting in the car. Clara got in and said, drive. And Rosa drove, and Clara took out her phone and called Adrian. He answered on the first ring. The welfare check request, she said. I know, Delaney flagged it. We have less than 24 hours before someone acts on it. Then what do we do? Adrian said. We get ahead of it, he explained. Clara listened without interrupting, which was one of her great skills, complete listening, the kind where you absorb a thing fully before you begin to respond to it. When he finished, she said, That requires a different physician, one who has no connection to Halston. I have one, Dr. Renata Cruz. She's been my family's doctor for 12 years. She will conduct a genuine examination today, and she will document what she finds, which is a woman who is entirely competent and who left a care facility of her own volition for documented reasons. He paused. Her report goes on record. It's a competing medical opinion from a physician with a clean reputation. It doesn't kill the welfare check request, but it creates enough dispute that no one is going to act unilaterally on Halston's filing, while there's a conflicting professional opinion in the system. When 3 o'clock. I'll be there. She was there at 2:55 because she had been early to every appointment of her professional life, and she saw no reason to change that at 73. Dr. Renata Cruz's office was on the north side, a small practice in a building that smelled like old wood and competence, and Dr. Cruz herself was a woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the manner of someone who has been genuinely listening to patients for 3 decades rather than managing them. She did the examination thoroughly and without rushing. She tested Clara's cognition, her memory, her orientation, her physical state. She asked about the knee. She noted the effects of prolonged cold exposure and insufficient nutrition over the previous 24 hours. She documented everything with the particular precision of a physician who understands that this document is going to be read carefully by people who are looking for anything they can use. When she was done, she sat down across from Clara and said, You are a 73-year-old woman with well-managed hypertension, mild arthritis in both knees. More advanced in the left, some fatigue and mild malnutrition, consistent with insufficient food intake over the past several days, and a cognitive function that is, as far as I can determine in a clinical examination, completely intact. Thank you, Clara said. I'm going to recommend some things for the knee, Dr. Cruz said. And you need to eat more. I intend to, Clara said. The report was filed electronically at 4:20 that afternoon. Adrian's lawyer, Catherine Voss, had it in front of a different county official by 4:50 with a formal objection to the welfare check request on the grounds of the competing medical opinion and a request that no action be taken pending review. The official, a woman who Catherine had dealt with enough times to know was not in Halston's pocket, agreed to a 48-hour hold. 48 hours. It wasn't much, but it was what they had, and Clara had learned a long time ago that what you had was what you worked with. Tuesday arrived the way significant days sometimes do, looking exactly like any other day until it wasn't. Sophia stood in the bathroom of her apartment at 5:45 in the morning and looked at herself in the mirror with the particular focused attention of someone committing a version of themselves to memory. She had done this before, visiting her mother's grave 3 times in the past 14 months. She had done it before her job interview at Moretti's. She was doing it now. She looked ordinary. That was the point. She had dressed for ordinary dark pants, a plain long-sleeved shirt, the kind of soft-soled shoes that people who work night shifts in care facilities wear, because silence is both practical and respectful. Her hair was pulled back. No jewelry except a small pair of stud earrings that she would not have thought twice about in any other context. She looked like exactly what she was going to say. She was a woman who had worked in home health care for 6 years and was picking up part-time facility work to cover a gap between longer-term positions. Her background check had come back clean, which it was, because her actual background was clean, which was one of the things about this that was both simpler and more important than it might have been otherwise. She was not impersonating anyone. She was Sophia Bennett with her real name and her real history, going to work in a care facility where her mother had died. That was either the most natural thing in the world or the most dangerous, and she had decided sometime around 3 in the morning that the distinction didn't matter. She picked up her bag. She left. The overnight aide shift at Rosewood Haven began at 11 p.m. and ended at 7 a.m. The position she had been placed in was specifically for the memory care wing, which was on the 2nd floor. and which was, she understood from the facility's own published materials, the most restricted area of the building, which also meant it was the area with the most complete records, because memory care residents required more detailed documentation of medications and interventions than residents in the general population. It was also she had gathered from reading between the lines of what Clara had told her the wing where the pattern had been most visible. She had 4 days before her first shift. 4 days to learn the building's layout, the staff rotation schedule, and where the records were physically kept, because she was not going to go in blind to any of it. She spent those 4 days the way she had spent her most important preparations in her life, methodically, with the kind of attention that other people sometimes mistook for calmness, but was actually something else. Something closer to the state where focus goes so deep that there's no room left for the feelings that would otherwise be using that space. She talked to Adrian twice. She talked to Clara every day. She talked to Dana Okafor once, a meeting at the same coffee shop on Michigan Avenue where Dana had sat across from Clara 4 days earlier, and Dana had looked at her for a long moment when they sat down and said, "You know what you're walking into." "Yes," Sophia said. "If it goes wrong, then it goes wrong," Sophia said. My mother went into that building for 6 weeks of rehabilitation and came out in a box. So yes, I know what I'm walking into. And I'm walking in anyway. Dana had looked at her recorder and then at Sophia and said, "Off the record, I have a daughter. She's 8. If someone did to my mother what was done to yours, I would walk into that building too." She put the recorder on the table. "On the record, be careful. The story is no good to anyone if you don't come out with it." "I'll come out with it," Sophia said. Tuesday night, 10:45 p.m. Sophia walked through the front door of Rosewood Haven Senior Center on North Clark Street. For the first time, said her name to the night receptionist, showed her temporary badge from Midway Care Staffing, and was directed to the nursing station on the second floor, where the overnight supervisor, a woman named Janet, who had the efficient exhaustion of someone who had been doing this work for 20 years, handed her a brief orientation packet and said, "Memory care. You're on rooms 12 through 19 tonight. Vitals at 2 a.m. Medication distribution at 6 notes in the system after each resident interaction. Questions?" "No questions," Sophia said. She went to work. She did the job. She did it carefully and with complete attention, because the residents in rooms 12 through 19 were real people who needed real care, and she was not going to shortchange them by being somewhere else in her head. An 81-year-old man named Curtis, who woke at midnight, convinced it was morning, and needed patient, gentle redirection. A woman named June, who was frightened in the dark and needed someone to sit with her for 20 minutes until the fear passed. Not because the fear was rational, but because it was real, which was what mattered. She did all of it with the full presence of someone who had chosen to be there, which she had regardless of the reasons. At 2:30 a.m. during the window between vitals and the next scheduled check, she went to the nursing station. Janet was in the break room. The station was empty. Sophia moved to the records terminal. She had a login credential her own legitimately issued, and she used it to access the resident charts for the memory care wing. She was not looking for anything she was not authorized to see in her role as an overnight aide. Overnight aides reviewed charts as a standard part of care. She started with the current residents and moved backward. The pattern was there. It took her 40 minutes to find the first clear instance because she was looking for something specific, and because the documentation was arranged, she realized in a way that was not designed to obscure, but that happened to require someone with a specific lens to read correctly. The medication adjustments were logged as routine clinical decisions. The timing, the sequence, the correlation with the financial documentation that appeared in the adjacent administrative files, none of it was flagged because no single person reviewing any single record would see what she saw when she held all of them at once. She photographed every page she could access. She did it with the calm efficiency of someone who has been nervous for so long that the nervous energy has converted into something else, something cleaner and more useful. At 4:15, something changed. She heard footsteps. Not the soft-soled shuffle of the overnight staff or the shuffling uncertainty of a resident who had wandered from their room. Heels. Hard-soled shoes on the corridor floor, moving with purpose. She closed the records terminal and moved away from the nursing station and picked up a clipboard and walked toward room 14 with the steady pace of someone who has always been exactly where they are, doing exactly what they appear to be doing. The footsteps went past. She did not look up from the clipboard. When they had passed, she stood in the doorway of room 14 for a moment, and the resident inside, an elderly woman named Miriam, who slept deeply and peacefully, regardless of what was happening around her, bless her, continued to breathe with the slow rhythm of someone entirely at rest. Sophia exhaled. She went back to work. At 6 a.m., during the medication distribution round, she found what she had been most specifically looking for and most afraid of finding. It was in the chart of a current resident, a 79-year-old man named George Paulson, who had been at Rosewood Haven for 4 months, and who Sophia had noticed during the night had a quality about him that reminded her of what Clara had described about Harold Briggs, a quality of absence, a flatness in the eyes that was not sadness and not confusion, but something more like erasure. George Paulson's medical history, which she had reviewed during the chart access window, showed no history of the psychiatric diagnosis that was currently listed as the justification for the medication he had been receiving for the past 3 weeks. She photographed his chart. She photographed the medication log. She photographed the original intake paperwork, which listed his assets and the contact information for a nephew in Indianapolis, who appeared to have had no communication with the facility in the past 6 weeks, according to the visitor log. She photographed the financial trust transfer form dated 18 days ago, which bore George Paulson's signature in handwriting that was shakier and less formed than his signature on the intake documents from 4 months earlier. She put her phone back in her pocket. At 7 a.m., she handed off to the morning aide who came to relieve her, a cheerful young man named Marcus, who arrived exactly on time with a travel coffee mug and a podcast playing in one earbud. "How was the night?" he asked. "Quiet," she said. Curtis had a rough patch around midnight but settled. June needed company around 1. The rest were steady. "Good to know," he said, making a note. "You're back Thursday." "Thursday," she confirmed. She walked out. She walked to the parking lot and got into her car and sat there for a moment. The morning was early and pale. The kind of morning that has not yet decided what kind of day it's going to be. She sat and breathed and let the previous 8 hours move through her, not avoiding the weight of it, but not letting it flatten her either. Her phone buzzed. A text from Adrian. 1 word. "Well?" She looked at her phone for a moment. Then she typed back, "I have it." She started the car. She did not go straight to Rosa's house where Clara was staying, because that was where anyone watching her would expect her to go. And Adrian had told her 3 days ago that if she came out with something, she needed to follow the protocol they had established, which was a specific route, a specific handoff point, and a clean transfer of the photographs to a secure location before she went anywhere near anyone associated with the case. She followed the protocol. The handoff happened in the parking garage of a building on Michigan Avenue, and the person she handed it to was Catherine Voss, Adrian's lawyer, who received the phone from Sophia's hand, copied the photographs to an encrypted drive in under 4 minutes, returned the phone and said, "You did not give me this, and I was never here." "I was never here either," Sophia said. "Are you all right?" Sophia thought about George Paulson's eyes. She thought about the signature on the financial transfer form that didn't look like the signature on the intake documents. She thought about Marcus with his travel coffee mug and his cheerful morning handoff, genuinely caring for the people in those rooms and genuinely unaware of what was happening in the layer underneath the care. "I'm going to be," she said. She went home and showered and changed and drove to Rosa's house. And when Clara opened the door and looked at her face, the 73-year-old woman who had been a teacher for 31 years and who had learned to read everything that people's faces said, Clara looked at her and said simply, "You got it." "I got it," Sophia said. Clara stepped back from the door. Sophia came in. They sat at Rosa's kitchen table, and Sophia told her what she had found. And Clara listened with the complete, organized attention she had always brought to the things that mattered. and when Sophia described George Paulson's chart, Clara's face did something very specific and very controlled. "He's still in there," Clara said. "Yes." "He is alive and he is in there right now." "Yes." Clara looked at the table. "Then we don't have time," she said. "Whatever timeline we had, it's moved up. George Paulson is in that building right now, and what I saw happen to Harold and Beverly and Thomas cannot be allowed to happen to him." Sophia looked at her. "Adrian's meeting with Delaney is tonight." "It can't wait for tonight," Clara said. She picked up her phone. She called Adrian. He answered immediately. "George Paulson," she said. "Room 18 Memory Care Wing. He has been there 4 months. His medication has been adjusted without clinical justification. His assets have been transferred. His family contact has not heard from him in 6 weeks." She paused. "Adrian, he is alive. Right now he is alive. And I know what happens next if we wait." The silence on the line lasted exactly 3 seconds. "I'll call Delaney now," Adrian said. "I'll move the meeting to this afternoon. What about the documents?" "Catherine has them. They're clean." Another pause. "Clara, this is moving into the part where it gets very loud very fast. Victor Halston is going to know by tonight that someone was inside, and that we have what we have. There will be no more time for careful." "There hasn't been time for careful since I walked into your restaurant," Clara said. "I'm not asking for careful, I'm asking for fast." "You'll have it," he said. He hung up. What followed was the kind of afternoon that happens rarely in a life, but that, when it does, compresses time into something almost unrecognizable, where 3 hours can contain more actual event than the previous 3 months. Catherine Voss delivered the encrypted photographs to Delaney at 1 p.m. 2 hours earlier than the scheduled meeting at a location that was not the place on Wabash because there was no time for that now. She did not explain how they had been obtained, and Delaney, who had been in his line of work long enough to understand when not to ask a question he would have to put in a report, did not ask. He looked at the photographs. He looked at the medication logs, and the financial transfer forms, and the chart documentation, and the original intake paperwork with the different signatures. He looked at the name George Paulson. He made a call of his own. At 2:30 p.m., while Victor Halston was in a meeting on the 43rd floor of his building on Michigan Avenue, with 2 men who were there to discuss what legal escalation against Adrian Moretti should look like. In the next 72 hours, his phone rang. He looked at the name on the screen, and something in his face changed in a way that the 2 men across from him noticed, and he stood and excused himself with the smooth composure of someone who has practiced appearing unrattled, even when the ground is moving. He answered in the corridor. The call was 68 seconds long. When he came back into the room, he said, "We need to postpone this conversation." And the 2 men looked at his face and did not argue. He went to his office and closed the door and sat down. The call had been from a source inside the federal oversight body. The source had told him that a file he had believed was stalled had just been reactivated, that new evidence had been received that morning, and that there were people talking about George Paulson. Victor sat very still. He had managed this situation for 18 months. He had managed it at the investigative level and the administrative level and the political level. He had managed Clara Whitman for 8 months. He had managed Sophia Bennett without even knowing she needed managing until now. He had managed Adrian Moretti's response with the legal and regulatory pressure that had always been his most reliable tool. But George Paulson was alive, and George Paulson, once someone looked at him with the right lens, was not just a resident. He was a living witness to a current, ongoing pattern. He was not a historical case. He was not a record in a file. He was a man in room 18 of the memory care wing who, if examined by the right physician in the next 24 hours, could demonstrate something that a pharmaceutical toxicologist could look at and identify and name. Victor picked up his phone. He called Burke. "Rosewood Haven," he said. "Dr. Marsh, tonight." Burke was quiet for a moment. Just one moment. Then, "Mr. Halston, if we move on Paulson now and if the federal file has already been reactivated—" "I heard you," Victor said. "I need you to understand something." His voice was still controlled, still the voice he had always used. But underneath the control, something had shifted. something that had always been there in the form of certainty and was now something else. Whatever happens to me afterward, I am not going to let this unravel because of one resident. Not when I am this close to having everything documented in a way that is permanent. Burke was quiet again longer this time. "Burke," Victor said. "I'm here," Burke said. But his voice was different too, something in it that had not been there in 11 years of working together. Something that sounded like a man reaching the edge of a territory he had been willing to cross and finding on this particular night that he was no longer willing. "I need you to make the call," Victor said. A pause. "I'm not going to do that," Burke said. Victor went still. Burke said, "I've been with you for 11 years. I have done things I won't talk about in a room with a lawyer. But I am not going to be part of what you're describing. Not for Paulson. Not for any of this. Not anymore." Victor said nothing. "I'm sorry," Burke said, which was the most unexpected thing, and he said it like he meant it, or at least like the version of himself that had been there before, all of it meant it. He hung up. Victor sat alone in his office with the phone in his hand, and for the first time in 20 years, he could feel the actual shape of what he had built, not as an architecture of power, but as the weight of every decision that had made it, and the weight was specific and very heavy. He made one more call. Not to Dr. Marsh, to his attorney. At 3:45 p.m., Adrian received a call from Delaney. "Federal warrants," Delaney said. "Rosewood Haven, financial records, pharmaceutical records, medical files. Judge signed at 3:30. They're serving tonight." Adrian was in Rose's kitchen. Clara was across the table from him. Sophia was on the couch in the next room, finally allowing herself the sleep she had not taken since her shift ended. He looked at Clara. He said into the phone, "George Paulson." "They know," Delaney said. "He's the first thing on the welfare list. He will be examined by an independent physician tonight. If what you're telling me is confirmed." "It will be confirmed," Adrian said. He hung up. Clara was looking at him with the eyes of a woman who had spent 8 months being told she was confused, and who had walked 40 minutes in the rain in 11-degree weather, and who had placed $3.14 on a marble counter, not knowing whether the night would end with her back inside Rosewood Haven or in a place where someone believed her. He said, "It's tonight." She said, "Tell me." He told her. She sat across from him and she listened, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Harold, Beverly, Thomas." She said each name separately with space between them. "I want them to know we're here. I want them to know we didn't forget." "They know," Adrian said. Clara looked at him. "Do you believe in that?" He thought about Margaret Serrano, who had sat with a 5-year-old boy every afternoon and taught him that a person who could read could never truly be trapped. He thought about the post office box she had established 15 years ago for a contingency she had never stopped preparing for. "I believe in this," he said. "What's happening right now, that's what the living owe the dead." Clara nodded. "Then let's finish it," she said. The warrants were served at Rosewood Haven at 7:14 p.m. on a Tuesday, which was a detail that would later appear in Dana Okafor's Tribune article as a piece of incidental information, but which Clara, when she read it, would hold on to for reasons she did not entirely explain to anyone. 7:14. She had walked into Moretti's restaurant exactly 8 days earlier at what she later calculated was approximately 7:20 p.m. 8 days from walking through a door with $3.14 to federal agents walking through a different door with warrants. She turned this over in her mind, the way she turned things over thoroughly and without sentimentality. And what she concluded was that the timing meant nothing cosmically, but meant everything practically, because 8 days was also approximately how long George Paulson had remaining, according to the independent physician who examined him that evening before the medication he had been receiving, in quantities that bore no legitimate clinical relationship to his actual diagnosis, would have done irreversible damage. 8 days. She sat with that number in Rose's kitchen and let it be what it was. Adrian came in at 8:30 with Catherine Voss, and a man Clara had not met before, a quiet, compact man in his 40s named Hargrove, who worked for the U.S. Attorney's Office, and who had the particular manner of someone whose job has trained them to absorb large quantities of information quickly and react to almost none of it visibly. He shook Clara's hand and sat down and opened a thin folder and said, "Mrs. Whitman, I've read your notebook. I'd like to go through it with you." They went through it for 2 hours. He asked precise questions. She gave precise answers. When she wasn't certain of something, she said so, and when she was certain, she said that too, and the distinction was clear each time in a way that Hargrove, she could tell, registered and appreciated, without making a production of it. Catherine sat to one side and said almost nothing, which was, Clara had come to understand one of the ways a very good lawyer operates, present, attending to everything, saving the words for when they were necessary. At 10:15, Hargrove closed his folder. "The pharmaceutical records Sophia Bennett photographed confirm the pattern you documented," he said. "The toxicology finding on George Paulson correlates with what was done to Harold Briggs based on the chart notation you photographed. We now have a current living case and historical documentation of the same methodology. That's the threshold." He looked at Clara steadily. "You did the work, Mrs. Whitman. The evidence you built is what made this possible." Clara looked at him. "What happens to George Paulson?" "He was transferred to Northwestern Memorial 2 hours ago. He's receiving appropriate medical care. His nephew has been notified and is flying in from Indianapolis tonight." Clara closed her eyes for just a moment. Just one moment. Then she opened them and said, "And Victor Halston." "Mr. Halston's attorney contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office at 4 p.m. today. Mr. Halston is cooperating with the investigation." The room was quiet. "Cooperating," Clara said. "That is the current status." She looked at Adrian, who was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed and his face carrying the expression of a man who has seen this particular development before and has decided with complete accuracy what it means. "He's trying to minimize his exposure," Clara said. "Yes," Hargrove said. "That is correct. And his cooperation, does it protect him? That depends entirely on the extent of the information he provides and the corroboration that information receives." Hargrove paused. "It does not protect him from the documented evidence already in our possession. Whatever terms his attorney negotiates apply to additional charges, not to what has already been established. What has already been established is substantial." "Meaning he goes to prison. Meaning the evidence strongly supports a prosecution that would result in that outcome." He was careful with the language. She noticed the way lawyers are careful, not evasive, but precise. "I am not in a position to guarantee outcomes. I can tell you what the evidence shows." "The evidence shows he killed people," Clara said. "Harold Briggs and Beverly Marsh and Thomas Galecki. Those are the 3 I documented. There may be others before I arrived. We are looking at the full history of the facility going back to when Halston took control." Hargrove looked at his folder. "There are 7 additional names that will be examined." 7. Clara absorbed this. 7 names she had not known. 7 people who had gone into that building and not come out in a way that bore any relationship to the natural order of things. 7 people whose families, if they had families, had perhaps been told the same smooth, practiced words about peaceful passing and complications and the difficulty of predicting how illness progresses in the elderly, and had gone home and arranged funerals and sat with grief that they had understood as ordinary loss when it was something else entirely. "I want those names," she said. Hargrove looked at her. "Not for my own purposes," she said. "I want to know them. I want to say them. The same way I said Harold and Beverly and Thomas, because they were real and they deserve to be named by someone who understands what happened to them." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. Then he wrote something on the inside of the folder and slid a single sheet across the table. 7 names. Clara looked at each one. She read them slowly. She did not hurry through them. Then she folded the sheet and placed it in her purse alongside the notebook. Hargrove left at 10:40. Catherine followed him to the door and exchanged a few words with him that Clara couldn't hear, and then came back to the kitchen and sat down and looked at Adrian. "Burke," she said. Adrian said, "What about him?" "He's the reason we're sitting here with this outcome instead of the other one," Catherine said. "He refused the call. If he had made that call tonight, George Paulson—" She didn't finish the sentence. I know, Adrian said. His attorney is talking to Hargrove's office separately. He's going to cooperate fully. He's giving them 11 years. Adrian was quiet. Clara said, He said he was sorry. Both of them looked at her. When he refused, Clara said. Victor's assistant. He said he was sorry. Sophia told me he said it before he hung up. She looked at her hands. People do terrible things for a long time and then they stop. I don't know what to do with that exactly, but I think it matters that he stopped. Catherine looked at her for a moment. You are an unusual person, Mrs. Whitman. I'm a school teacher, Clara said. We spend our careers believing people can change. If we stopped believing that we couldn't do the job. Adrian looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize over the past 8 days. The one that was specifically his, not warm. Exactly, because warmth was not the primary register of his face, but something adjacent to it, something that looked like a man recognizing something he respects and is not entirely accustomed to finding. He said, You should sleep. I know, she said. I will. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them. First, I want to tell you something. He sat down. I've been thinking about what comes after this, she said. And I want to say something while I still feel it clearly before time passes, and I find the polite way to say it instead of the true way. She looked at him. When I walked into your restaurant 8 days ago, I was prepared for a great many outcomes. I was not prepared for you. He said nothing. Margaret told me you were a man who kept his word, Clara said. She told me you were not good in the way that word is used in church. She told me you were useful in a way that goodness alone rarely is. She paused. I don't think that was complete. I think she was protecting you from the embarrassment of being described accurately to someone who hadn't met you yet. Adrian looked at the table. She was right about the word-keeping, Clara said. But I've watched you for 8 days, and I've watched you make decisions, and I've watched you treat me as a person whose thinking was worth attending to, even when it would have been much easier and arguably more efficient to treat me as someone to be managed. And I want you to know that I noticed. And that it mattered. And that Margaret was right to trust you. She folded her hands. That's all. The kitchen was quiet. Then Adrian said, She told me about you too. Clara looked up. She told me that if I ever met a woman named Clara Whitman, I should pay attention. He was looking at the table still. She said you were the most honest person she had ever known, and that honesty at that level was both rarer and more powerful than most people understood. Clara said, She never told me she said that. She never told me. She wouldn't have, Adrian said. She never paid compliments in a way that would have made the recipient feel they needed to respond to them. Clara looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her genuine, in the way that laughter is genuine, when it arrives without preparation. No, she said. She certainly did not. They sat there in the quiet kitchen, the two of them, and the weight of the past 8 days moved through the room and settled into something that was not exactly peace, but was the thing that follows when people have done something very hard together and have come through it and are still themselves on the other side. Sophia called at 11:30. She had been home since early afternoon sleeping, and she sounded like someone who had slept for the first time in weeks rather than hours, which was probably accurate in some essential way. I saw the news alert, she said. Federal investigation. Rosewood Haven. Halston. It's real, Clara said. She had answered the phone because Adrian handed it to her with a slight incline of his head that communicated she should be the one to tell her. A silence on the line. Then Sophia said, George Paulson. Northwestern Memorial. He's stable. His nephew is coming tonight. Another silence. Longer. Clara waited through it because she had learned that Sophia's silences were not empty. They were the sound of someone processing at the full depth of what was available to her. My mother, Sophia said finally. Yes, Clara said. Her name is in the file. What happened to her is part of what they're looking at. She paused. Sophia. It won't undo it. I need you to know that I know that. I know, Sophia said. I know it won't. A breath. But she'll be named. People will know it wasn't just that she wasn't just... She stopped. She wasn't just an old woman who died peacefully, Clara said. She was Eleanor Bennett. She asked an aide to tell her daughter not to blame herself. She was thinking about you at the end. And now the whole truth of what happened to her is going to be on the record. She paused. That's not nothing, Sophia. No, Sophia said quietly. It's not nothing. They talked for a few more minutes, and when they hung up, Clara sat at the table for a long moment in the particular quiet that follows when something has been completed and the next thing has not yet begun. Then she went upstairs. She slept. The morning was different. Not in any way that was obvious from the outside. The kitchen still smelled like Rose's coffee. The light still came through the same window at the same angle. The sounds of the street outside were the same street sounds they had always been. But Clara, who had spent her professional life understanding that what matters is not always what is visible, felt the difference from the moment she woke up. She lay still for a moment and ran the familiar inventory. What she knew. What remained unknown. What would need to happen next, and in what order. The inventory was different now. Shorter in some ways, longer in others. The immediate crisis had moved out of the category of emergency and into the category of process, which was harder in some ways and easier in others, and she had enough experience with both to know the distinction. She went downstairs. The next 2 weeks were the kind of weeks that do not look dramatic from inside them, but that viewed from afterward turn out to have been the weeks that determined everything. Victor Halston's cooperation produced names and documentation that extended the case beyond Rosewood Haven into 2 affiliated facilities in the suburbs that had been operating under the same structure. The total number of victims as the investigation widened reached 41. 41 people. 41 names. Clara learned all 41. She wrote them in the back of a new notebook she had bought herself, a proper one, hardcover, the kind that opened flat and had good paper, and she said them aloud alone in the small house that Adrian had arranged for her on the north side, a rental in a quiet building with a lock that worked properly and a window that faced east so the morning light came directly in. She said all 41 names, and then she sat in the reading chair she had arranged exactly right on the second day in relation to the window and the lamp, and she was quiet for a while. Dr. Marsh, the physician whose signature had appeared on the medication adjustments, surrendered his medical license and cooperated with the investigation, which produced the clinical documentation that established not just the pattern, but the mechanism, the specific pharmaceutical protocol that Halston had used and that Marsh had implemented, the one that had looked to any individual reviewer examining any individual chart like a series of standard clinical decisions, but that across multiple cases and multiple facilities and multiple years was something that a toxicologist and a forensic accountant and a federal prosecutor could look at together and call what it was. Donna Okafor's series ran in the Tribune over 5 consecutive days beginning on a Monday. By Wednesday, it had been picked up by national outlets. By Thursday, the story had reached the kind of velocity that made it impossible to ignore, not just for the public, but for the state legislature, where 2 committee chairs who had spent years looking away from the regulation of private care facilities for elderly residents found themselves suddenly urgently interested in the question of oversight. Clara read every article. She was mentioned in the first piece, which ran with a photograph Dana had taken on her phone during their coffee shop meeting. Clara, in Rose's burgundy coat hands, folded on the table, looking directly at the camera, with the expression that was her natural expression, which was direct and calm and entirely unperformed. The caption said, Clara Whitman, 73 former elementary school teacher, whose documentation provided the foundation for the federal investigation. Patricia called from Seattle the morning the first article ran. Mom, she said, which was the same word she had led with 8 days earlier, but entirely different in register. Not afraid. Something else. You're in the Tribune. I know, Clara said. You're in the Tribune, and Adrian Moretti is mentioned in the second paragraph, and it says, he's a mom. What exactly is he? He's a complicated person who kept his word, Clara said. That's the most accurate thing I can tell you. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you safe?" "I'm safe." Are you actually okay?" Clara looked out the east-facing window at the morning light. "I'm better than I've been in a long time," she said. "I'm in a place where the lock works and the window faces the right direction. I have a reading chair." She paused. "Come visit." "I'm already looking at flights," Patricia said. She arrived on Saturday. She stood in the doorway of the small house on the north side and looked at her mother, and then crossed the room without saying anything, and held on to her for a long moment, the way adults hold on to their parents when they have been afraid and then relieved, and are not yet entirely certain the relief is permanent. Clara let her. Then she said gently, "All right, come in. I'll make tea." Patricia sat at the kitchen table and looked at the new notebook on the counter and the familiar old coat on the hook by the door. Clara had kept it, had thought about replacing it, and decided not to, not yet, because the coat was the coat she had been wearing when she walked into Moretti's restaurant. And she felt in a way she could not have entirely explained that some things needed to be kept as they were for a while before they were changed. "You could have called me," Patricia said, "when it was happening. You could have told me earlier." "I didn't want you to be afraid," Clara said. "I was afraid anyway." "I know. But you were afraid in Seattle, which is much better than you being afraid in Chicago, where there would have been nothing for either of us to do about it except be afraid together." She set the tea in front of her daughter. "I needed to do it myself. You understand?" Patricia looked at her. "I understand," she said. "I don't entirely like it." "You don't have to like it." Patricia laughed a short, slightly helpless laugh that was very much her mother's daughter. "No, I suppose I don't." They sat together over tea, and Clara told her the whole of it, every part, in order with the clarity and organization of someone who has already told it twice to federal investigators and once to a reporter, and has learned through repetition exactly how the story goes. Patricia listened with her hands around her cup and her face doing what it did, which was be entirely transparent. Clara had always been able to read Patricia's face the way she read text completely and without effort. At the part about the notebook under the pillow, Patricia's hands tightened on the cup. At the part about Harold Briggs coming to dinner and not being Harold anymore, Patricia looked out the window. At the part about walking out the front door of Rosewood Haven at 11 o'clock with the notebook inside her coat, Patricia said very quietly, "You were so alone." "I was," Clara said. "And then I wasn't." 3 weeks after the warrants were served, Adrian came to the house on the north side for the first time. He arrived in the early evening and knocked, rather than letting himself in, which Clara noted as the gesture it was. She opened the door and looked at him, and he looked at her, and there was a moment of the particular awkwardness that sometimes exists between people who have been through an intense experience together and are now encountering each other in an ordinary context for the first time. She stepped back. "Come in." He came in and sat at the kitchen table, and she made coffee, because that was what you did when a person came to your home and they sat across from each other in the small kitchen, and the evening came through the east-facing window at its evening angle and was unremarkable and quiet. "Delaney says the case is solid," Adrian said. "I know. Hargrove told me the same thing." She paused. 41 names. "I know." "Are you all right?" she asked. He looked at her. It was, she suspected, not a question he was asked with great frequency. He stopped. Started again. "I've been thinking about something Margaret said, the last time I saw her, about what I wanted to be remembered for." Clara waited. "I've spent 20 years building something," he said. "And most of what I built, I'm not going to tell you it was good. You know what I am, and I've never been interested in pretending otherwise." He looked at the coffee cup. "But I've also been thinking that maybe the whole picture is larger than the part I've been focused on. That what a person does in the middle of something when they didn't plan to be there, when it would have been easy to walk away, maybe that's part of the picture too." Clara looked at him. "It's part of the picture," she said. "Margaret thought so." Margaret was right about most things. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to do something," he said. "With some of what I have. A foundation maybe, For elderly people in situations like the one you were in: financial abuse, exploitation, isolation, legal resources, advocates. He looked at her. I don't know exactly how to build it yet. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I taught 31 years. I know exactly how to build things from the beginning. She paused. I'd like to help. He looked at her with the expression that was specifically his, not quite a smile, something more deliberate and more real than a smile. I was hoping you'd say that, he said. Sophia called that evening after Adrian had gone, while Clara was washing the 2 coffee cups and listening to the particular quiet of a house that belonged to her. Nursing school, Sophia said. I got the acceptance letter today. Clara set down the cup she was holding. Tell me. The RN program at Loyola. I applied 6 weeks ago. I thought after everything I thought the right thing to do was to be someone who could be inside those places legitimately. As a nurse. Somebody who could see the whole picture and know what to look for and actually be able to do something about it in real time. She paused. The program starts in January. Clara stood at the sink and looked at nothing specific and felt something move through her chest that was in the same family as pride, but more specific than that, the feeling of watching someone find the shape of what they're supposed to do and step into it. Your mother would be proud of you, Clara said. A silence. The kind that means something. I think she'd be proud of both of us, Sophia said. Clara looked out the window. The evening had gone dark in the way Chicago evenings go dark fully and without apology. The city was out there in its enormous, ordinary completeness. All those lights, all those lives, all that specific human urgency moving through the streets below. Sophia, she said. The aide. The one at Rosewood Haven who remembered your mother's message. Yes. Did you ever find out her name in the investigation? Maria Gutierrez, Sophia said. She was one of the staff members who cooperated immediately. She'd been there 4 years and she told investigators she'd known something was wrong for most of it, but didn't know what to do with what she knew. A pause. She's going to testify. Good, Clara said. She was brave keeping that message, even without knowing who would hear it. She held it for 14 months, Sophia said. Some things are worth holding, Clara said. They said goodnight. Clara dried the cups and put them away, and turned off the kitchen light, and went to the reading chair that she had arranged exactly right, the way reading chairs need to be arranged. And she sat in the dark for a while, with the city out the window, and the notebook on the table beside her, and Margaret's name on the medical bracelet against her wrist. She thought about a Tuesday evening 8 days ago that had changed everything. She thought about $3.14 on a marble counter, and the way silence had moved through a restaurant when a voice cut across it, and the particular quality of that silence, which was not embarrassment and not fear, but something more honest, the silence of a room full of people encountering something they did not have a category for. She thought about Harold, who had been an engineer, Beverly, whose daughter drove from Evanston every Sunday, Thomas, who had set money aside for grandchildren's educations. She went through all 41 names in her mind, the way she had been doing each evening, not as a ritual of grief, but as a practice of memory, because she had learned in 31 years that the most important thing a person can do for someone is simply to hold them in mind, to refuse to let them become a number, or a case, or a notation in a file. She thought about Sophia, who was going to be a nurse who was going to spend her career inside the places that needed people who could see the whole picture. She thought about Adrian, who was going to build a foundation, who was sitting somewhere across the city, thinking about what he wanted to be remembered for, and who was, she had concluded, doing the work of answering that question in the only way that ever actually answers it, which was not through intention, but through action. She thought about Patricia, who was asleep in the guest room down the hall, who had come from Seattle because her mother had asked her to, who had sat at this table and listened to the whole story, and at the end had said simply, "I'm glad you walked into that restaurant." And Clara had said, "I am too." 6 weeks after the federal warrants were served, Victor Halston was indicted on 43 counts, including elder financial exploitation, involuntary manslaughter, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice. Dr. Kenneth Marsh, surrendered his license and pled guilty to 4 counts of medical negligence. The director of Rosewood Haven, a man named Philip Garrett, who had understood what he was participating in and had convinced himself over years of small decisions that the understanding was manageable, was charged separately and cooperated fully, and would spend the rest of his professional life explaining himself in courtrooms and licensing hearings. The 2 affiliated facilities were closed by state order within 72 hours of the warrants. Their combined residents, 63 people, were transferred to appropriate care under federal supervision, and a team of investigators began the work of examining each of their histories. Dana Okafor won a press award for the Tribune series. At the ceremony, she thanked her source by name, Clara Whitman, former elementary school teacher, Chicago, and said she had never in 15 years of journalism met anyone who kept a cleaner distinction between what she observed and what she concluded, and that it was the most important lesson in the trade she had learned from someone who had never worked in the trade. Clara read about the award in the morning paper. She cut out the paragraph that mentioned her name. She folded it and put it in the new notebook in the back behind the 41 names. Then she made her coffee and sat in the reading chair and looked out the east-facing window at a morning that was cold and clear and specific. The way Chicago mornings are specific in December, each one its own distinct thing rather than an interchangeable piece of a season. She was not the same person who had walked out of Rosewood Haven 8 days before all of this began. She was not the same person who had stood outside Moretti's restaurant and counted coins for the 4th time and decided to push the door open. She was not even entirely the same person who had put the notebook under the pillow for the first time and understood what she was doing and what it might cost and done it anyway. She was still Clara Whitman. She was still 73 years old. She still had well-managed hypertension and a left knee that gave her trouble in the cold and the irreversible habit of arriving early to everything, and a bone-deep belief that the difference between a person who matters and a person who doesn't was not the scale of what they did, but the honesty with which they did it. The reading chair was arranged exactly right. The lock worked. The light came in at the right angle. On the table beside her was the new notebook and the coffee and the morning paper, and Rosa's burgundy coat hanging on the hook by the door, and a photograph of Margaret Serrano that Patricia had brought from Seattle because she knew her mother would want it somewhere she could see it. Margaret was laughing in the photograph. Clara did not remember the exact moment it was from, but she remembered the quality of the laughter, which had always been the laughter of someone who understood that life was serious, but that seriousness and joy were not opposites. She looked at the photograph. "I found him," she said, "like you told me to." And outside the window, the city that had produced Adrian Moretti and Victor Halston and Harold Briggs and Eleanor Bennett and Margaret Serrano, and 41 names in a notebook, and one reporter who understood that evidence is not the story. The people are the story. That city moved through its morning, in its enormous particular entirely indifferent way, full of lives that did not know each other, and choices that would ripple outward in directions no one was tracking, and moments that would mean nothing until they meant everything. A poor woman had walked into a restaurant with $3.14. A man who had spent 20 years building the wrong kind of power had looked at a medical bracelet and remembered a promise. A daughter had carried her grief into a building where her mother had died and come out with the truth. And the truth, placed carefully in the right hands at the right moment, had done what truth always does when it is handled with that level of care and that level of courage it had held. It had held against money and against authority and against the particular cruelty of people who believed that the elderly were invisible, that the poor were powerless, that the isolated had no one who would come. They were wrong. They had always been wrong, and Clara Whitman, who had known that her whole life, and had proved it once more at the cost of 40 minutes in the rain and $3.14 she could not afford to spend, sat in her reading chair in the morning light, and drank her coffee, and was in the specific and undecorated way that she had always understood that word free.